Every story has a moment that changes everything. And today, we're about to discover it. Rain crashed against the towering glass windows of downtown Chicago, like the city itself was trying to warn somebody. 48 floors above the streets below, Henry Monroe stepped out of the private elevator inside his luxury penthouse, exhausted from another 14-hour business day that had drained every ounce of energy from his body. His tie hung loose around his collar, his expensive black coat rested over one shoulder, and his mind was still trapped inside boardrooms, contracts, and billion-dollar negotiations. But the second those elevator doors opened, everything changed. "Nancy, give them to me." Melissa's scream ripped through the penthouse so violently that Henry froze in place. Not irritated, not angry, terrified. That was terror in her voice. A sound so sharp, it instantly sent tension through his chest. Then came the crying, small, panicked. His twins. Henry's heart slammed hard against his ribs. Grayson and Gabriella. The briefcase slipped from his fingers and hit the marble floor with a loud crack, but he barely noticed. His body was already moving fast toward the living room as another scream echoed through the penthouse. "Don't touch them." Henry turned the corner and stopped cold. Nancy stood near the fireplace, clutching both twins tightly against her chest. Gabriella buried her tiny face into Nancy's neck, while Grayson cried against her shoulder, gripping her shirt with trembling little hands. Nancy herself looked shaken, her curls slightly messy, breathing uneven, eyes wide with fear. Across from her stood Melissa in silk pajamas, pointing furiously. "Henry," Melissa shouted the moment she saw him. "Tell her to put my children down right now." For one strange second, nobody moved. The rain outside hammered harder against the glass walls. Lightning flashed across the room, and Henry felt something deep inside him tighten painfully. Because none of this made sense. Nancy had worked inside his home for nearly 2 years. 2 years, never disrespectful, never careless, never dramatic. She was the calmest person in the penthouse. So why did she suddenly look like someone trying to protect those children from danger? Henry looked at the twins again. Gabriella refused to even look toward Melissa. And Grayson? Grayson looked terrified. "What's going on?" Henry demanded sharply. Nancy opened her mouth immediately. "Sir, please listen to me first." "She's lying," Melissa snapped, cutting her off. "I walked upstairs and found her hiding in our bedroom with the twins." Nancy shook her head quickly. "That's not true." Melissa laughed bitterly. "Oh, really? Then explain why my babies are crying in your arms." Henry's breathing slowed, not because he felt calmer, because his instincts had started working, and instincts had helped him survive rooms filled with powerful men his entire life. Tiny details mattered, reactions mattered, fear mattered, and right now, something felt deeply wrong inside his own home. "Nancy," Henry said carefully, "tell me exactly what happened." Nancy swallowed hard. She looked emotionally torn apart. Not angry, not defensive. Hurt. "The twins were upstairs near the bathtub," she said softly. "The water was too hot. Gabriella almost slipped." Henry slowly turned toward Melissa. For half a second, just half a second, Melissa's face changed, and Henry noticed wealthy men didn't stay successful by ignoring small reactions. "That's ridiculous," Melissa replied quickly. "I was standing right there." Nancy's voice remained respectful. "No, ma'am, you weren't." The silence inside the penthouse became unbearable. Rain hit the windows. The fireplace crackled softly. Grayson kept crying against Nancy's shoulder. Henry stared at Melissa. Melissa stared at Nancy. And Nancy looked like somebody carrying a burden too heavy to hold anymore. Before Henry could speak again, little Grayson lifted his head. His tiny cheeks were wet with tears, and in the middle of the silence, the little boy whispered 3 words that made Henry's stomach tighten instantly. "No hot water." Nobody spoke. Melissa forced a laugh too quickly. "They're babies, Henry. He doesn't even understand what he's saying." But Henry wasn't looking at Melissa anymore. He was staring at Gabriella. Because the moment Melissa took one step forward with her arms open, Gabriella screamed, not normal crying, not fussing, pure panic. The little girl clung desperately to Nancy's neck, shaking violently. Nancy immediately rocked her gently. "It's okay, baby. It's okay." And that was the moment something cold moved through Henry's chest. Because Melissa didn't look heartbroken, she looked irritated. Like the crying embarrassed her. Like it ruined the perfect image she wanted everything to have. Henry suddenly remembered moments he pushed aside before. Moments that felt different now. The time Gabriella had a fever, and only calmed down when Nancy sang softly beside her crib. The night Grayson fell asleep in Nancy's arms after rejecting everyone else. The strange way Melissa always seemed uncomfortable during simple parenting moments. Feeding schedules, bedtime routines, diaper changes. Everything felt rehearsed instead of natural. And for the first time since becoming engaged to Melissa, Henry felt uncertainty. Real uncertainty. Before this story gets even crazier, comment where you're watching from and don't forget to subscribe because this truth shocked everyone inside that penthouse. Welcome to Mr. Obama Stories, where stories don't just get told, they come alive. This is the home of powerful American stories, stories of struggle, success, mystery, history, and the unforgettable moments that shaped people, communities, and dreams. From inspiring life journeys to shocking real events, every story here is crafted to make you think, feel, and see the world differently. At Mr. Obama Stories, we believe every voice matters and every story carries a lesson. Whether it's motivation, history, real-life drama, or untold experiences, you'll always leave with something unforgettable. So sit back, relax, and let the story begin, because here, every story has a meaning, and every meaning has a story. Subscribe and become part of the journey. Back inside the penthouse, Melissa stepped forward again, this time trying to soften her voice. "Henry," she said carefully, "she's becoming too attached to them." "I told you this would happen." Nancy looked down immediately, not guilty, wounded. Henry noticed that too. "I would never hurt them," Nancy whispered. Melissa crossed her arms tightly. No employee should be acting like their mother. The words hit the room heavily. Nancy's eyes watered instantly, but she stayed quiet. And somehow, that silence bothered Henry more than yelling would have. Because Nancy wasn't trying to win an argument. She looked like somebody trying to stop a disaster before it destroyed everyone. And Henry still didn't know the woman he trusted most had been hiding a secret capable of destroying his entire family. Henry stood motionless in the center of the living room, while thunder rolled across the Chicago sky outside. The penthouse suddenly felt smaller, too quiet, too tense. The only sound now came from the twins crying softly against Nancy's chest. Melissa wiped beneath her eyes quickly, trying to regain control of the situation. But Henry knew her well enough to notice the change in her breathing. She was nervous, very nervous, and that alone disturbed him. Because Melissa rarely lost composure, especially not in front of other people, especially not in front of staff. Henry slowly loosened the cuffs of his shirt while staring directly at Nancy. "Nancy," he said calmly, "start from the beginning." Melissa turned immediately. "Henry, why are you questioning her like she's the victim?" "Because I asked a question," he replied without looking away from Nancy. That answer irritated Melissa instantly. Nancy adjusted Gabriella carefully against her shoulder before speaking. Her voice trembled slightly. "I was upstairs folding laundry in the nursery when I heard water running inside the bathroom." Henry listened carefully. "The twins were alone near the bathtub," Nancy continued. "The water was extremely hot. Gabriella almost slipped climbing near the edge." Melissa threw her hands up immediately. "This is insane." Nancy kept going. "I grabbed them because they were crying." "You grabbed them because you keep crossing boundaries." Melissa snapped. Grayson flinched at the sound of her voice. Henry noticed, again, tiny reactions, tiny truths. Children reacted honestly before adults learned how to pretend. Nancy looked toward Melissa respectfully. "I'm not trying to disrespect you, ma'am." "Then stop acting like their mother." The words exploded across the room. Gabriella instantly buried her face harder into Nancy's neck, and Henry felt another uncomfortable twist inside his chest. Melissa noticed it too. That made her angrier. "You see?" she said, pointing toward Nancy. "This is exactly what I warned you about. They're too attached to her." Henry finally spoke. "Why are they afraid of you?" The question stunned the room. Melissa blinked rapidly. What? You heard me. That's ridiculous. Then why does Gabriella scream every time you try to hold her? Melissa stared at him in disbelief. Are you seriously taking the maid side over mine? Nancy lowered her eyes instantly. Henry hated that word suddenly. The maid, not Nancy. Not the woman who helped raise his children since birth. Just the maid. And somehow, that bothered him more than it should have. Melissa stepped closer toward him. You're exhausted, Henry. You just walked into chaos and now she's manipulating the situation. Nancy shook her head softly. No, sir. I would never. Stop apologizing. Melissa barked. Henry's jaw tightened. Nobody's yelling anymore. The authority in his voice silenced the room instantly. Outside, rain streaked across the giant glass windows overlooking downtown Chicago. The city lights reflected softly against the marble floors, while tension sat heavy between all three adults. Then Henry looked toward Grayson. The little boy's cheeks were still wet from crying. Buddy, Henry said gently, what happened upstairs? Grayson sniffled. Nancy rubbed his back softly. The water hurt. Henry's chest tightened again. Melissa laughed nervously. He's confused. But Henry noticed something important. Melissa answered quickly, every single time the children spoke. Too quickly. Like she feared silence. Like silence might reveal something she couldn't control. Nancy finally looked toward Henry again. I wasn't trying to overstep, sir. I just didn't want them getting hurt. Her voice carried sincerity so naturally that Henry struggled to doubt her. And honestly, that terrified him. Because Melissa was his fiancée. The woman he planned to marry in front of the entire country's elite social circles within a few months. Beautiful, educated, graceful, perfect for magazine covers, perfect for billionaire charity galas, perfect beside powerful men. But suddenly, standing inside that penthouse, Henry realized something uncomfortable. Melissa always looked perfect, but Nancy felt real. And there was a difference. A huge difference. Melissa folded her arms tightly. She's making you question me. Henry didn't answer immediately, because the truth was, he already had questions long before tonight. Questions he ignored. Questions he buried beneath work schedules and public appearances. Questions he convinced himself didn't matter. But now those memories returned sharply, like pieces finally connecting. Henry remembered the night Gabriella got sick with a fever. Melissa panicked after only 20 minutes. Nancy stayed awake the entire night beside the crib singing softly while placing cool cloths against Gabriella's forehead. By morning, Gabriella stopped crying the second Nancy touched her. Henry remembered another afternoon when Grayson fell near the piano. Melissa froze. Nancy reacted immediately. She scooped him into her arms before he even started crying. And somehow, Nancy always knew exactly what the twins needed without trying. Bottle temperatures, sleeping habits, favorite songs, snack routines, everything. Meanwhile, Melissa constantly checked parenting books and phone apps like she was studying for an exam she feared failing. At first, Henry told himself she was simply adjusting to motherhood differently. But now the memories felt heavier, more complicated, more painful. Melissa suddenly pointed toward Nancy again. She's been emotionally manipulating them for months. Nancy looked stunned. That's not true. You made them dependent on you. Henry finally interrupted. Enough. The room fell silent again. Melissa's breathing grew uneven. Henry stared at her carefully. When was the last time you spent a full day alone with the twins? Melissa looked caught off guard. What kind of question is that? A simple one. I'm busy too, Henry. Nancy quietly looked away. That small reaction didn't escape him either. Melissa immediately noticed where his attention shifted. Oh my God, she whispered bitterly. You really are defending her. No, Henry answered carefully. I'm trying to understand why tonight feels so wrong. Nobody spoke. The fireplace crackled softly nearby. Gabriella had finally stopped crying completely inside Nancy's arms. And somehow, that alone shook Henry deeply, because the little girl looked safe there. Safe. Melissa suddenly walked toward the twins again, forcing a gentler tone. Gabriella, baby, come to mommy. The second she reached forward, Gabriella cried again, harder this time, desperate, her tiny fingers wrapped tightly into Nancy's shirt. Nancy instinctively rocked her gently. "It's okay. You're okay." Henry watched Melissa carefully, and once again, that expression appeared, not sadness, frustration, like she couldn't understand why affection refused to obey her. That was the moment Henry felt the first real crack inside his relationship. Not anger, not betrayal, something worse, doubt. Deep, painful doubt, because children recognize safety naturally. Nobody taught them that, and tonight, both twins had chosen Nancy without hesitation. Melissa stepped backwards slowly, humiliated. "You're letting her turn them against me." Nancy looked horrified immediately. "I would never do that." Her voice cracked emotionally this time. And for the first time all night, Henry noticed tears forming in Nancy's eyes. Not dramatic tears, exhausted tears. The kind people carried after suffering quietly for too long. Henry's voice softened slightly. "Nancy." But before he could continue, Nancy whispered something that changed the atmosphere completely. "There are things inside this house you don't see, sir." Melissa froze instantly. Absolute fear flashed across her face before disappearing again. But Henry saw it, and now he couldn't unsee it. Because wealthy men learned one dangerous truth very early in life, people feared exposure more than consequences. And Melissa suddenly looked terrified of what Nancy might say next. Melissa stood frozen near the center of the living room, while Henry slowly processed Nancy's words. "There are things inside this house you don't see, sir." The sentence stayed inside his mind long after the room became quiet again. Rain continued sliding down the massive penthouse windows overlooking Chicago's glowing skyline, but Henry barely noticed the city anymore. His attention remained fixed on Nancy, on the twins, on the tension sitting heavily inside his own home. Melissa recovered first, her voice sharpened instantly. "What exactly is that supposed to mean?" Nancy lowered her eyes. "Nothing disrespectful, ma'am." "No," Melissa snapped. "You don't get to throw accusations around and act innocent afterward." Nancy carefully adjusted Gabriella against her shoulder again before speaking. "I'm not accusing anybody." "Then explain yourself." Henry finally stepped between them slightly. "That's enough." Melissa looked stunned. Henry rarely raised his voice, rarely interrupted her publicly. But tonight felt different. Everything felt different. Henry looked toward Nancy again. "You can speak freely." Nancy hesitated, and that hesitation alone made Henry uneasy, because it looked less like fear for herself and more like fear for the children. "I just think the twins need more attention," Nancy said carefully. Melissa laughed coldly. "Oh, please." But Henry kept listening. "They get nervous easily," Nancy continued softly. "Especially when voices get loud." Melissa folded her arms. "So now I'm a bad mother because I raised my voice?" "No, ma'am," Nancy answered respectfully. "That's not what I said." But the damage was already done, because Henry noticed something uncomfortable again. Nancy remained calm, no matter how harsh Melissa became. No insults, no attitude, no disrespect, just restraint. And honestly, that calmness carried more weight than yelling ever could. Gabriella slowly lifted her tiny face from Nancy's shoulder and looked toward Henry with watery eyes. "Daddy." Henry walked closer immediately. "Hey, princess." The little girl reached one hand toward him, while still clinging tightly to Nancy with the other. That small detail nearly broke something inside him, because, even now, even after seeing him, Gabriella still refused to let Nancy go. Henry gently touched his daughter's hair. "You okay?" She nodded weakly, then pointed toward Nancy. "Nancy, stay." The room became silent again. Melissa looked away immediately. Humiliation flashed across her face. Henry felt it too, because no mother wanted to hear another woman become her child's source of comfort. But still, something inside him kept whispering the same painful question. Why? Why did the twins trust Nancy so naturally? Henry suddenly remembered another moment from months earlier. A charity dinner. Hundreds of wealthy guests filled the penthouse that night, while cameras flashed constantly around him and Melissa. Everything looked beautiful. Perfect. But upstairs in the nursery, Gabriella wouldn't stop crying. Melissa grew frustrated after 20 minutes. She's ruining the evening. Henry remembered how sharply those words hit him at the time. Ruining the evening, not hurting, not uncomfortable, ruining appearances. Nancy walked upstairs quietly afterward. 5 minutes later, the crying stopped completely. When Henry checked the nursery later that night, he found Nancy sitting in the rocking chair humming softly while Gabriella slept peacefully against her chest. The room felt warm, safe, real, and for reasons he didn't fully understand then. Henry stayed standing in the doorway, longer than necessary, just watching them. That memory returned now with painful clarity. Melissa suddenly grabbed her phone from the table aggressively. "I'm done standing here being judged by employees." Henry frowned slightly. "Nobody's judging you." Melissa laughed bitterly. "You can't even hear yourself anymore." Nancy finally stepped back carefully. "I should take the twins upstairs." Melissa pointed instantly. "No. Put them down." Gabriella immediately started crying again. Henry's chest tightened. Nancy looked torn apart emotionally. "I don't want them upset. You don't get to decide that." "Melissa." Henry's voice carried warning this time. Real warning. Melissa turned toward him slowly, and for the first time in their entire relationship, Henry noticed resentment inside her eyes. Not sadness. Not insecurity. Resentment. Like she blamed him for what was happening. Like she hated losing control of the room. Nancy quietly spoke again. "Sir, I promise I never meant to create problems." Henry looked at her carefully, and suddenly memories began stacking inside his mind, one after another. Late nights in the kitchen, small conversations, tiny peaceful moments that somehow mattered more now. Nancy laughing while teaching Grayson how to clap along to old gospel music. Gabriella falling asleep on Nancy's shoulder during thunderstorms. The twins crawling toward Nancy first every morning. Henry remembered coming home exhausted from meetings one night and hearing music floating softly through the penthouse. Warm music, the kind he never heard growing up. He followed the sound into the kitchen and found Nancy cooking while the twins danced clumsily near the island in matching pajamas. The entire room felt alive. "Careful," Nancy laughed as Grayson almost slipped. "Y'all got too much energy tonight." Henry remembered standing there quietly for several seconds, watching, listening, feeling something unfamiliar. Peace. Real peace. Nancy noticed him first. "Oh, sorry, sir. We didn't mean to make noise." But Henry surprised himself that night. "No," he said quietly. "Leave the music on." Nancy smiled warmly, and somehow that simple smile stayed with him long after the night ended. Melissa never created moments like that. Everything with Melissa felt organized, scheduled, polished. Dinner reservations, perfect photographs, luxury vacations, public appearances, even affection sometimes felt timed correctly for cameras. But Nancy brought warmth into rooms naturally, without trying. And now Henry realized the twins felt it too. Children recognized genuine energy before adults admitted uncomfortable truths. Melissa suddenly walked toward the bar area and poured herself water with shaking hands. Henry noticed that too. She was rattled. More than he'd ever seen before. "You know what this really is?" Melissa asked quietly, without turning around. "You pity her." Nancy looked confused. Melissa finally faced them again. She came from nothing. She walks around acting humble, and everybody falls for it. Nancy's expression changed slightly then. Not anger. Pain. Deep pain. But still she stayed respectful. "My grandmother taught me that kindness matters more than money." Melissa laughed sharply. And there it is. The inspirational speech. Henry frowned immediately. "Melissa, what?" she snapped. "You don't hear it? She wants everybody to think she's morally superior." Nancy shook her head softly. "I never said that." "No," Melissa replied coldly. "You just make people feel it." Henry watched Nancy carefully, and suddenly he remembered the first day she arrived at the penthouse nearly 2 years earlier. Simple navy blue dress, no designer labels, no expensive jewelry, no performance, just quiet dignity. She shook his hand respectfully and thanked him for the opportunity before immediately asking where the children's rooms were located. Not the celebrity guest rooms, not the luxury kitchen, the nursery. At the time, Henry barely thought about it. Now it felt important. Because Nancy never chased status inside that home. She cared about people. And maybe that was exactly what Melissa feared most. Melissa slowly set her glass down. You think they love you more than me, don't you? Nancy looked genuinely shocked. No, ma'am. But you enjoy this. Nancy's eyes watered again. I would never want children caught between adults. That answer hit Henry hard, because it sounded honest. Painfully honest. And Melissa knew it too. The room grew heavy again. Nobody moved for several long seconds. Then little Grayson lifted his sleepy face from Nancy's shoulder and whispered softly, "Nancy home." Henry felt the words deep inside his chest, because the little boy didn't mean the penthouse. He meant her. Nancy looked emotionally shattered hearing it. Melissa looked completely devastated. And Henry finally understood something he'd ignored for months. Homes weren't built by marble floors or billion-dollar views. They were built by warmth, patience, safety, presence, and somehow, the emotional center of his home had quietly become the woman everybody overlooked. Nancy carefully kissed Gabriella's forehead, and as Henry watched the twins relax peacefully in her arms, one terrifying thought settled fully into his mind for the very first time. The twins weren't afraid by accident. The penthouse finally became quiet, close to midnight. Not peaceful, just exhausted. The earlier confrontation still hung heavily inside the walls, even after Melissa disappeared into the master bedroom without another word. Henry remained downstairs alone for nearly 20 minutes staring out at the Chicago skyline while unfinished thoughts crowded his mind. Nothing about tonight felt normal anymore. Not Gabriella screaming. Not Grayson trembling. Not Nancy's expression when she said there were things inside the house he didn't see. And definitely not the growing feeling inside his chest that something in his perfect life had started breaking long before he noticed it. Upstairs, soft music floated quietly from the nursery. Henry looked toward the staircase automatically. That same warmth again. That same calm feeling he never quite understood. Without thinking much about it, he slowly walked upstairs. The nursery door sat slightly open. Inside, dim golden light glowed softly across the room, while Nancy sat in the rocking chair holding Gabriella against her chest. Grayson slept nearby inside his crib, wrapped in a blue blanket. Nancy hummed quietly under her breath, while gently rubbing Gabriella's back. The little girl's breathing had finally slowed. Henry stayed silent near the doorway, watching. Nancy noticed him after a few seconds. "Oh," she whispered softly. "I'm sorry, sir. Did the music wake you?" Henry shook his head. "No." Nancy looked back down at Gabriella instinctively. She got scared again after everything downstairs. Henry walked inside slowly, and for the first time all night, the tension inside his chest loosened slightly. The nursery didn't feel cold like the rest of the penthouse. It felt lived in. Small stuffed animals rested near the shelves. Children's drawings sat taped beside the changing table. Soft blankets folded carefully nearby. Life existed inside this room. Real life. Nancy looked exhausted herself. Her curls rested loosely around her face now, and faint shadows sat beneath her eyes. Henry suddenly realized something uncomfortable. He couldn't remember the last time he'd seen her truly rest. "You should get some sleep," he said quietly. Nancy smiled faintly. "I will, after she settles down." Henry looked toward Gabriella again. "She always calms down with you." Nancy hesitated slightly before answering. "I think children can feel when somebody is patient with them." The answer stayed with him. Patient, such a simple word. But patience was rare inside wealthy homes. Everything in Henry's world moved fast. Deals, schedules, flights, deadlines, appearances. Even family moments often felt squeezed between obligations. But Nancy never rushed the twins, not once. She treated every small moment like it mattered. Every scraped knee, every bedtime story, every tiny fear. Henry slowly sat down in the chair across from her. The silence between them felt strangely comfortable, not awkward, not forced, just quiet. Gabriella finally drifted asleep completely against Nancy's shoulder. Nancy smiled softly, looking down at her. She fight sleep like it personally offended her. Henry let out a quiet laugh before he could stop himself. That sounds accurate. For the first time that night, Nancy laughed too. Small, tired, real, and somehow, hearing it, made the nursery feel warmer. Henry leaned back slightly. I don't think I ever thanked you properly. Nancy looked confused. For what? For everything. She shook her head immediately. You don't need to thank me for doing my job. But Henry disagreed silently. Because, somewhere along the way, Nancy stopped feeling like staff. Not because boundaries disappeared, because presence mattered, and Nancy's presence had quietly become part of the twins' emotional world. Henry glanced toward Grayson, sleeping peacefully nearby. They really love you. Nancy's expression softened emotionally. I love them too. The words came naturally. No hesitation, no performance, and somehow that honesty hit harder than dramatic speeches ever could. Nancy carefully placed Gabriella inside the crib beside her brother before standing slowly. The room remained quiet, except for the soft jazz still playing from her phone near the changing table. Henry recognized the song immediately. You always play this? Nancy smiled faintly. My grandmother loved old jazz. The mention of her grandmother changed her face instantly. Not dramatically, but enough for Henry to notice grief still living there quietly. You were close to her? Nancy nodded slowly. While folding a tiny blanket carefully, she raised me. Henry listened without interrupting. We didn't have much money growing up, Nancy continued softly, but she always made our apartment feel full. Full? Music, food, neighbors stopping by, church people talking too loud. She smiled gently at the memory. You could barely think straight during holidays. Henry laughed quietly. That sounds chaotic. It was. Nancy smiled, but it was love. That word settled deeply inside the room. Love, not expensive gifts, not luxury, not status, just warmth, shared between people. Nancy leaned lightly against the dresser. She worked herself sick, taking care of everybody. Henry noticed her voice thinning slightly now. When she got ill, Nancy paused carefully. Hospital bills started piling up fast. Henry stayed silent. I took every job I could find. There was no self-pity in her voice, just truth. I cleaned offices at night for a while, worked double shifts, tried everything. Henry frowned slightly. And, still, Nancy nodded. Still wasn't enough. The nursery became quiet again. Henry suddenly understood something important. Nancy's kindness didn't come from an easy life. It came from surviving difficult ones without becoming bitter. That changed the way he saw her completely. She passed away 6 months before I came here, Nancy said softly. Henry looked at her carefully. And you still took this job after that? Nancy gave a tired smile. I needed the money. Then, after a short pause, she added quietly, but honestly, I think I also needed people. That answer hit Henry unexpectedly hard, because loneliness recognized loneliness. And Henry suddenly realized both of them carried it differently. His came wrapped in luxury. Hers came wrapped in grief. But loneliness still hurt the same. Nancy looked toward the twins again. The first week here, Gabriella wouldn't sleep unless somebody held her. Henry smiled faintly. She still does that. Nancy laughed softly. Yeah. Then her smile faded slightly. Honestly, I tried not to get attached. Henry looked at her. But they make it impossible. The tenderness in her voice felt genuine enough to ache. Henry suddenly remembered one night, months earlier, nearly 2 a.m. Both twins refused to sleep. The penthouse looked like complete chaos. Baby bottles everywhere. Cartoons playing softly in the background. Grayson crying. Gabriella throwing cereal onto the floor. And Nancy standing in the kitchen attempting to make pancakes while looking completely defeated. Henry walked downstairs half asleep wearing sweatpants and immediately smelled something burning. Nancy? She turned around too fast. The pancake in the pan had turned completely black. Oh Lord, she groaned. Don't judge me. Henry burst out laughing immediately. You almost started a fire. I'm struggling tonight, sir. You sure this is food? Nancy laughed so hard she nearly dropped the spatula. I miss one measurement, and suddenly everybody becomes Gordon Ramsay. Henry laughed harder than he had in weeks. Real laughter. The kind that loosened pressure from his chest. Eventually, they sat at the kitchen island eating terrible pancakes while the twins finally calmed down nearby. Henry remembered watching Nancy that night while she talked animatedly about growing up around crowded family cookouts on the South Side. Music blasting, kids running everywhere, arguments over potato salad recipes, nobody staying quiet for more than 30 seconds. "You rich people dinners, be silent for no reason," Nancy teased that night. Henry nearly choked laughing. "I thought quiet dinners were normal." "No, sir," she replied confidently. "Somebody got to argue about something before dessert." That memory returned so vividly now that Henry smiled without realizing it. Nancy noticed. What? Nothing. But honestly, it wasn't nothing, because those small moments had started becoming the best parts of his days, and that realization scared him more than he wanted to admit. Nancy finally picked up her phone and lowered the music volume slightly. "You should try getting some sleep too, sir." Henry stood slowly. But before leaving, he looked toward the twins one more time. Peaceful, safe, comforted. Then he looked back at Nancy, and for the first time since becoming a father, Henry quietly realized the emotional heartbeat inside his home had never come from wealth. It came from the woman everyone overlooked. By the following week, the penthouse looked normal again, at least on the surface. The tension from that stormy night no longer exploded openly through the house, but something had shifted permanently between Henry and Melissa. Conversations became shorter, dinner silences lasted longer, and every time Henry looked at the twins now, questions quietly returned to his mind whether he wanted them there or not. Still, life around powerful people rarely slowed down long enough for emotional problems to fully breathe. By 8 every morning, Henry was already trapped inside meetings, conference calls, investment negotiations, and endless conversations with people who smiled carefully while calculating profit margins in their heads. Most days started before sunrise. Most nights ended long after the city went quiet. Private drivers, private elevators, private jets, luxury hotels with marble bathrooms larger than most apartments. From the outside, Henry Monroe looked like a man living every dream America promised ambitious people. Magazine covers called him disciplined. Financial networks called him visionary. Business schools studied his investments. But none of those people saw him sitting silently inside dark hotel suites at midnight, eating room service pasta alone, while answering emails beside floor-to-ceiling windows. Success surrounded Henry with people constantly, but somehow, real closeness always stayed just out of reach. One Thursday evening, Henry returned home after a brutal 14-hour workday in Manhattan. The private flight back to Chicago had been delayed because of weather, and his head pounded from 3 back-to-back investor meetings that felt more exhausting than productive. The moment he entered the penthouse, he immediately heard laughter upstairs. Not forced laughter, real laughter. Children's laughter. Henry loosened his tie while listening carefully. Then he heard Nancy. "No cheating, Grayson. I saw that." More giggling followed instantly. For reasons he couldn't explain, exhaustion lifted slightly from his chest. He walked upstairs quietly toward the playroom. Inside, the twins sat on the carpet surrounded by toy blocks, while Nancy pretended to lose dramatically during some made-up game they clearly invented themselves. Gabriella pointed proudly at a crooked tower. "I win!" Nancy gasped loudly. "Oh no, I've been defeated." Grayson laughed so hard he fell sideways onto the carpet. Henry stood near the doorway unnoticed for several seconds, watching again. Lately, he had been doing that more often than he realized. Watching, listening, feeling warmth from scenes he didn't fully understand emotionally. Nancy finally noticed him first. "Oh. Hey, sir." The twins immediately ran toward him. "Daddy." Henry bent down instantly, hugging both children tightly while their excited voices filled the hallway at the same time. And suddenly, for a few seconds, his stressful day disappeared completely. Not because of the penthouse, not because of money, because of this feeling. Family, or at least the version of family he desperately wanted to believe existed. Melissa appeared moments later wearing an elegant cream-colored outfit, clearly prepared for some social event. "There you are," she said, while checking her reflection briefly in the hallway mirror. The Henderson dinner starts in an hour. Henry's shoulders tightened immediately again. The Hendersons, another wealthy couple, another formal dinner, another night pretending everybody inside the room actually liked each other. Melissa noticed his expression. "You forgot." "No," Henry replied tiredly. "I remembered. You don't sound excited." Henry kissed Gabriella's forehead, absent-mindedly. "I'm exhausted." Melissa sighed dramatically. "We already confirmed attendance." Nancy quietly started cleaning the toys nearby, clearly trying not to intrude on the conversation. "You can still go," Henry said carefully. "I may stay home tonight." Melissa stared at him. "You're skipping another event?" "I haven't had dinner with the twins all week." "You're building a company, Henry. Sacrifices come with that." Nancy kept her eyes lowered respectfully, but Henry noticed something subtle again. Sadness, not judgment, just sadness. Because she heard the emptiness too. Melissa grabbed her purse from the table. "Well, successful people don't disappear every time they feel tired." The comment irritated him more than usual, not because it sounded harsh, because it sounded rehearsed, like success mattered more to her than peace ever could. Henry finally looked directly at her. "When was the last time we ate dinner here without guests, cameras, or business conversations?" Melissa blinked slightly. "What kind of question is that?" "A simple one." "We're adults, Henry, not teenagers playing house." The words sat heavily between them. Even Nancy stopped moving briefly. Melissa quickly realized how cold that sounded, and softened her voice. "I'm just saying responsibilities matter." Henry nodded once slowly. "So does presence." Silence followed. Then Melissa glanced toward Nancy before speaking again. "Well, at least the twins always have entertainment." Nancy immediately looked uncomfortable. "I should finish cleaning upstairs." Henry spoke before she could leave. "Nancy." She paused. "Would you mind making dinner here tonight instead?" Melissa looked stunned. "You're seriously canceling?" "I want one quiet evening with my kids." Melissa's jaw tightened slightly, but, after a few seconds, she forced a smile. "Fine." The word didn't sound fine at all. An hour later, the penthouse kitchen smelled like garlic, butter, and fried chicken, while soft music played quietly in the background. Henry sat at the kitchen island helping Gabriella color, while Grayson stacked crackers into unstable towers nearby. And for the first time in days, he could breathe again. Nancy moved comfortably through the kitchen preparing dinner, while occasionally laughing at the twins' random stories. The atmosphere felt easy, natural, not polished, not staged, real. Henry watched her quietly for a moment. Nancy noticed. "What? You cook every meal like you're feeding 20 people." Nancy laughed softly. "That's how I grew up." Henry smiled faintly. "Big family, big everything," she replied while stirring something on the stove. "Big personalities, big arguments, big church hats." Gabriella giggled. "Church hats?" Nancy pointed dramatically. "Massive ones. Like satellites." The twins burst into laughter. Even Henry laughed harder than expected. And once again, that warmth filled the kitchen naturally. No effort, no pretending. Nancy handed Henry a spoon carefully. "Taste this." He took one bite and immediately widened his eyes. "This is incredible." "Told you." "What is it?" "Simple food." Henry shook his head. "No. This tastes like somebody actually cared while making it." Nancy looked at him quietly for a second. After that, long enough for something unspoken to pass gently between them. Not romance. Not yet. Recognition. Two lonely people slowly realizing they felt calmer around each other. The twins eventually started arguing over cornbread pieces, while Nancy laughed trying to settle them down. Henry watched the scene carefully, and suddenly, a painful realization hit him harder than expected. This was the happiest his home had felt in months, maybe longer. Not during luxury vacations, not during charity galas, not during public celebrations. Right here, inside the kitchen, with children arguing loudly over food, while somebody laughed nearby. The realization almost embarrassed him, because billionaires weren't supposed to crave ordinary things this badly. Nancy suddenly looked toward him again. "You okay?" Henry answered honestly, before thinking too hard. "Yeah." Then, after a short pause, "Actually, I think I forgot what this feels like. Nancy understood immediately. He could tell by her face, the quiet kind of happiness. Henry nodded slowly. Neither of them spoke for a few seconds, because some truths sounded heavier once spoken aloud. Right now, tell me in the comments. Do you think Henry was already falling for Nancy before he understood the truth? Later that night, after the twins fell asleep, Henry remained downstairs answering emails, while Nancy cleaned the kitchen quietly nearby. Most people inside Henry's world feared silence. They rushed to fill every quiet second with networking, business, status, or distractions. But, somehow, silence around Nancy felt comfortable. "You work too much," she said softly, while drying dishes. Henry smirked faintly, without looking up from his laptop. "So I've been told." "I'm serious. So am I." Nancy leaned lightly against the counter. "What's the point of all this money if you're too exhausted to enjoy your own life?" Henry looked up then, not because the question offended him, because nobody asked him things like that anymore. Most people only asked what he could provide: investments, connections, opportunities, access. But Nancy asked questions like somebody trying to understand the human being underneath all the success. Henry closed the laptop slowly. "My father used to say, rest makes people weak." Nancy frowned immediately. "That sounds miserable." Henry laughed quietly. It was. For a second, his expression changed. More vulnerable than usual. "I spent most of my childhood inside quiet houses, filled with expensive furniture nobody touched." Nancy listened carefully. "No music," Henry continued. "No loud conversations. No real closeness. That's lonely." "It was normal to me." Nancy shook her head softly. "No child should grow up feeling emotionally invisible." The sentence hit Henry harder than she realized. Because emotionally invisible described his childhood perfectly. And maybe that was why he fought so hard to build a family now. Not for appearances, for healing. Nancy carefully placed the last plate inside the cabinet. "You know something?" "What?" "You smile more in this kitchen than anywhere else in the penthouse." Henry stared at her for a moment. And honestly, he realized she was right. By the middle of the month, Melissa stopped feeling comfortable inside her own home. Not because anything obvious had changed. Nobody crossed boundaries. Nobody flirted openly. Nobody said anything inappropriate. But emotional distance had started moving quietly through the penthouse, like cold air slipping beneath a closed door. And Melissa felt every second of it. She noticed the way Henry relaxed whenever Nancy entered a room. She noticed how the twins searched for Nancy first every morning. She noticed how laughter returned to the house whenever Nancy was nearby. Worst of all, she noticed Henry noticing it too. That terrified her. Melissa stood inside the walk-in closet one Friday evening, staring at herself in the mirror while fastening diamond earrings carefully beside her reflection. Everything about her looked flawless. The designer dress, perfect makeup, elegant posture. She had spent years mastering presentation, years learning how wealthy circles operated, how powerful wives behaved, how successful couples looked in public. Nothing about her appearance suggested insecurity. But inside, panic had quietly started growing, because no matter how polished she looked, the twins still cried for Nancy, and Henry had started looking at Nancy differently. Melissa noticed it during small moments first. At breakfast, inside the kitchen, near the nursery, tiny glances that lasted slightly too long. Longer conversations, comfort, ease. Henry smiled more around Nancy now. Melissa hated that most of all, because Henry rarely smiled around her anymore. That realization sat heavily inside her chest while she adjusted her bracelet angrily. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Henry stepped into the closet moments later wearing a charcoal suit while checking his watch. "You almost ready?" Melissa forced a calm expression immediately. "Almost." Henry nodded distractedly. Tonight shouldn't take long. Another charity event. Another ballroom filled with wealthy people pretending happiness could be purchased through networking and champagne. Melissa normally enjoyed those nights. Tonight she didn't, because lately every public appearance beside Henry felt less genuine, like she was slowly losing emotional ground she couldn't recover. Henry adjusted his cufflinks silently. Melissa studied him carefully through the mirror. You've been distant. Henry paused briefly. I've been busy. That's not the same thing. He sighed quietly. Melissa. No, she interrupted softly. Tell me honestly. What changed? Henry looked tired immediately. I don't want to argue before leaving. That wasn't an answer. Silence stretched between them. Melissa turned fully toward him now. Is this about the other night? Henry's jaw tightened slightly. The twins were scared. They're children. That doesn't make their emotions fake. Melissa crossed her arms. So now I'm being judged for one stressful moment. Henry rubbed his forehead slowly. That's not what I said. But it's what you're thinking. He didn't respond fast enough. And that silence hurt Melissa more than words. Because weeks ago, Henry would have defended her immediately. Now, he hesitated. Now he questioned things. Now, he watched her carefully. And Melissa knew exactly why. Nancy. Later that evening, after returning from the charity event, Melissa walked into the penthouse exhausted and emotionally irritated. The event had gone perfectly publicly. Smiles, photos, conversations with investors and politicians. The image remained intact. But the entire night Henry felt emotionally absent beside her, distracted, disconnected, and Melissa could no longer pretend not to notice it. As she walked toward the kitchen for water, she suddenly heard soft laughter. Henry's laughter. Real laughter. Melissa slowed immediately. The kitchen lights remained on. Nancy stood near the stove, flipping pancakes, while Henry leaned against the island, watching her with an expression Melissa hadn't seen from him in months. Peace. The twins sat nearby wearing pajamas while arguing loudly over syrup. You gave Grayson more. Gabriella complained. I did not. Nancy laughed. You did too. Henry chuckled softly. This is serious pancake corruption. Grayson gasped dramatically. Daddy, help. Nancy laughed harder. Melissa stood frozen near the hallway entrance, watching the entire scene quietly, and something painful moved through her chest, because they looked like a family, not staff and employer, not employer and nanny. Family, natural, warm, connected. Melissa suddenly felt like the outsider inside her own kitchen. Nancy looked up first, and immediately stopped smiling slightly. Oh, good evening, ma'am. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Henry turned around. You're home. Melissa forced a polite smile. Clearly, nobody missed the tension in her voice. The twins immediately ran toward her politely, but the excitement they showed Henry earlier wasn't there. Melissa felt it. Every painful inch of it. How was the event? Nancy asked respectfully. Wonderful, Melissa answered shortly. Nancy nodded and returned attention toward the stove. That calmness irritated Melissa even more now, because Nancy never fought back, never lost composure, never behaved disrespectfully, and somehow that made Melissa feel worse. Henry stood slowly. There are pancakes left if you want some. Melissa stared at the kitchen table again. Messy syrup bottles, children laughing, music playing softly from Nancy's phone. The room looked alive, and suddenly Melissa realized something devastating. Henry loved this version of life more than the glamorous world she spent years building beside him. That realization frightened her deeply. Nancy, Melissa said suddenly. Nancy looked up immediately. Yes, ma'am? Can I speak to you privately? Henry's expression shifted carefully. Melissa noticed. Even now he looked protective. That alone made jealousy burn hotter inside her chest. Nancy dried her hands calmly before following Melissa toward the back hallway near the pantry. The second they stood alone, Melissa's composure cracked. You need to remember your position. Nancy blinked softly. Excuse me? Melissa stepped closer. Don't play innocent with me. Nancy remained calm. I'm not trying to upset you, but you are. Nancy looked genuinely confused. I've done everything possible to respect boundaries. Melissa laughed sharply under her breath. That's exactly the problem. Nancy frowned slightly. You walk around acting humble while everybody falls in love with you. Nancy looked stunned. That's not true. No? Melissa whispered bitterly. The twins cling to you constantly. Henry listens to you more than me now. Nancy lowered her voice carefully. I would never try to come between your family. Melissa folded her arms tightly. Women like you always say that. The sentence landed heavily between them. Nancy went still. Not angry, just hurt. Melissa saw it immediately, and for one brief second guilt touched her conscience, but fear swallowed it quickly. Nancy answered softly, "My grandmother raised me to respect myself too much to chase what belongs to somebody else." Melissa looked away angrily. There you go again. Again? That calm voice, those little wise speeches. Everybody hears them and suddenly you become the good person in every room. Nancy's eyes watered slightly now. I'm not competing with you, but you're winning. The honesty shocked both of them. Silence followed instantly afterward. Nancy looked genuinely saddened hearing those words. And somehow, that made Melissa feel even smaller. Because deep down, she knew Nancy never intentionally tried taking anything from her. That made the situation worse. If Nancy had been manipulative, cruel, or disrespectful, Melissa could have hated her comfortably. But Nancy carried kindness naturally, patience naturally, warmth naturally. Things Melissa suddenly feared she could never imitate no matter how perfect she looked publicly. Nancy finally spoke carefully. You're engaged to him. You have a beautiful family. Why would you see me as a threat? Melissa stared directly into her eyes, because the painful answer finally became impossible to ignore. Henry looked emotionally alive around Nancy, and he looked emotionally exhausted around her. That truth humiliated her. Melissa stepped backwards slowly. You need to stop getting comfortable here. Nancy nodded respectfully. Yes, ma'am. But the dignity in her response somehow made Melissa feel weaker instead of stronger. As Nancy quietly walked back toward the kitchen, Melissa remained standing alone in the hallway, trying to steady her breathing. Then she heard laughter again. Henry laughing with the twins, Nancy responding softly. The sound echoed through the penthouse warmly, and for the first time since becoming engaged, Melissa felt afraid she might lose everything. Not because of money, not because of betrayal, because emotional connection could not be forced, and no amount of status, beauty, or luxury could compete against genuine peace. Melissa slowly looked back toward the kitchen entrance where Henry sat smiling beside Nancy while the twins argued over pancakes again. Nobody noticed Melissa watching them, but she noticed everything, every glance, every smile, every moment of comfort growing between them. And deep inside her chest, panic finally settled fully into place. Melissa realized she was losing something money could never force. The penthouse no longer felt emotionally balanced after the confrontation in the kitchen. Nobody openly discussed it. Nobody acknowledged the growing tension directly. But everybody felt it, especially Melissa. Over the next several days, her behavior changed in subtle ways Nancy couldn't ignore. She became quieter around Henry, short-tempered around staff, more controlling with schedules, and strangely protective of certain rooms inside the penthouse office wing. At first, Nancy tried convincing herself she was imagining things. After all, wealthy people carried stress differently. Maybe Melissa simply felt overwhelmed. Maybe the distance between her and Henry had finally become emotionally exhausting. But, deep down, Nancy knew something else was wrong. Something heavier, something hidden, and the feeling refused to leave her alone. One rainy Tuesday evening, Henry traveled to New York unexpectedly for emergency meetings involving a corporate acquisition. Melissa remained home. The twins fell asleep earlier than usual after spending most of the afternoon playing in the nursery. By nearly 11 o'clock, the penthouse had gone completely quiet. Nancy finished folding laundry slowly inside the hallway near the office corridor, while soft jazz played faintly through her earbuds. She moved carefully, trying not to wake anyone. Then she heard Melissa's voice. Sharp, low, panicked. Nancy paused immediately. The office door sat partially closed farther down the hallway, and light spilled softly across the marble floor beneath it. At first, Nancy intended to keep walking. The conversation clearly sounded private. But then she heard something that stopped her cold. I said the twins are secure. Nancy froze completely. Melissa's voice sounded nothing like her usual polished tone. This sounded frightened, angry, desperate. Nancy slowly lowered the towels in her hands. Inside the office, Melissa continued speaking quietly into the phone. No. Henry suspects nothing. Nancy's heartbeat quickened instantly. Something about the sentence felt wrong. Very wrong. Melissa paced inside the office now. Nancy could hear her heels moving sharply across the floor. The paperwork was handled already. Melissa whispered harshly. Why are you calling me again? Silence followed briefly. Nancy should have walked away. Every instinct told her to leave immediately. But then, Melissa said one word that made Nancy stop breathing for a second. DNA. Nancy's stomach tightened instantly. Inside the office, Melissa lowered her voice even further. I told you the DNA situation is buried. Nancy's fingers slowly tightened around the folded laundry. DNA? What DNA situation? Melissa continued pacing. No. Nobody can ever know what happened at the fertility clinic. Nancy felt her entire body go still. Fertility clinic. The words echoed painfully inside her mind. Because suddenly, tiny memories began connecting. The twins' unusual attachment to her. Melissa's emotional distance. The strange tension around motherhood. The way Melissa always seemed uncomfortable during natural caregiving moments. And now, DNA. Nancy's breathing became shallow. Inside the office, Melissa sounded close to tears. You promised me this mistake would never follow us. Mistake. Nancy slowly stepped backward, away from the office door. Terrified Melissa might suddenly walk out and find her listening. But before she could leave completely, Melissa spoke again. If Henry discovers the embryos were switched, everything falls apart. Nancy's heartbeat slammed hard inside her chest. Embryos? Switched? For a brief second, the hallway itself felt unstable beneath her feet. She leaned slightly against the wall, trying to process what she'd just heard. None of it made sense completely, yet. But enough made sense to frighten her deeply. Inside the office, Melissa's voice cracked emotionally. I already told you, I'm handling Nancy. Nancy froze again. Her name? Why was her name connected to any of this? Melissa lowered her voice sharply. She suspects absolutely nothing. Nancy slowly backed away farther this time, moving silently toward the nursery hallway before Melissa could exit the office. Her chest felt tight. Thoughts collided violently inside her mind. Embryos. DNA. Fertility clinic. Mistake. Nancy reached the nursery and quietly closed the door behind herself before finally exhaling shakily. The twins slept peacefully nearby. Completely unaware, their entire world might be built on secrets. Nancy stared at them silently. Then something strange hit her unexpectedly. Gabriella's birthmark, tiny, faint, near her shoulder. Nancy had seen that exact same birthmark before. Her own grandmother used to call it the family stamp. Nancy slowly sat down in the rocking chair beside the crib. Her hands trembled slightly now. No, that couldn't mean anything. Lots of people had birthmarks. Lots of children resembled caregivers they spent time around. She was overthinking. She had to be. But deep inside, fear had already started growing. The next morning, Melissa behaved almost too normal. That alone unsettled Nancy further. She smiled during breakfast, discussed charity schedules casually with Henry over the phone, even complimented Nancy's coffee. The performance felt careful now, controlled, like somebody trying too hard to appear relaxed. Nancy quietly watched her while feeding Gabriella pieces of fruit inside the kitchen. Melissa noticed immediately. What? Nancy looked down quickly. Nothing, ma'am. Melissa held eye contact for 1 second too long, and in that second, Nancy realized something terrifying. Melissa was watching her too, carefully, nervously, as if trying to determine whether she knew something already. That realization changed everything, because now, the penthouse no longer felt emotionally uncomfortable. It felt dangerous, not physically, emotionally, like truth itself had started moving silently through the rooms, waiting for the right moment to explode. Later that afternoon, while the twins napped, Nancy quietly opened her laptop inside her bedroom. Her pulse still felt uneven. She typed slowly into the search bar, fertility clinic embryo switch cases. Dozens of articles appeared instantly. Legal cases, hospital settlements, families discovering shocking truths years later, DNA testing, exposing clinic mistakes. Nancy's breathing slowed painfully. Her eyes scanned article after article, while memories continued crashing together inside her mind. The resemblance, the connection, the emotional bond, Gabriella's birthmark, Grayson's smile. Even Henry once jokingly mentioned how the twins somehow shared Nancy's expressions sometimes. At the time, everybody laughed. Now the memory made her feel sick. Nancy closed the laptop immediately. No, she whispered softly to herself, because if her growing suspicion became true, everything inside this family would collapse. Henry's engagement, the twins' identity, Melissa's entire life, even the children's emotional stability. Nancy pressed both hands against her face, trying to calm herself, but another painful truth already settled heavily inside her chest. Melissa wasn't merely jealous anymore. She was terrified, and terrified people often made desperate decisions. That night, Nancy barely slept at all. Every small sound inside the penthouse pulled her awake instantly. Every memory replayed differently now. Every interaction carried new meaning. And somewhere inside the darkness of the penthouse, Melissa remained awake too, watching, worrying, protecting secrets that were slowly running out of places to hide. Nancy spent the next 2 days pretending everything felt normal. It was the hardest thing she had done since arriving at the penthouse. Every conversation now carried hidden weight. Every interaction forced her to hide thoughts racing constantly through her mind. And the worst part? The twins made it impossible to emotionally distance herself while trying to think clearly. Saturday morning sunlight spilled softly across the nursery windows, while Grayson bounced excitedly across the carpet wearing dinosaur pajamas. Nancy, look. He lifted a toy airplane proudly above his head before crashing it dramatically into the edge of the crib. Gabriella burst into laughter immediately. Nancy smiled automatically despite the storm inside her chest. That plane ain't surviving another flight, baby. Grayson giggled harder. Nancy sat beside Gabriella, helping brush her curls carefully before breakfast. Then Gabriella turned suddenly and smiled. Nancy froze. That smile, the exact same crooked smile her grandmother used to tease her about growing up. The same slight curve on one side. The same tiny dimple, appearing only when genuinely happy. Nancy's fingers slowly stopped moving through Gabriella's curls. Her chest tightened painfully. No, 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 no. She immediately looked away. But then Grayson laughed nearby, and the resemblance hit her again. His eyes, the shape, the expression, even the way he tilted his head while thinking. Nancy felt cold all over suddenly. Because once the possibility entered her mind fully, she could no longer stop seeing pieces of herself inside both children. The realization terrified her, not because she wanted it to be true, because she desperately wished it wasn't. Later that afternoon, Henry returned home from New York, carrying toy bags for the twins, while exhaustion rested heavily across his face. The moment the children heard his voice downstairs, they ran toward the staircase excitedly. "Daddy." Henry immediately smiled. There it was again. That softness Nancy noticed only around the twins. The billionaire disappeared whenever they hugged him. For a few seconds, he simply became a father. Henry lifted Gabriella into his arms, while Grayson wrapped himself around his leg dramatically. Nancy watched quietly from the hallway, and suddenly guilt hit her hard. Because, if her suspicions were true, Henry had been living inside a lie without even knowing it. That thought hurt more than she expected. Henry looked toward Nancy after greeting the twins. "You okay?" Nancy forced a small smile immediately. "Yes, sir." But Henry studied her carefully. "You sure?" Nancy nodded quickly. "I'm fine." He didn't fully believe her. She could tell, but thankfully the twins distracted him again moments later, demanding to see their gifts. Nancy quietly stepped away toward the kitchen, trying to steady her thoughts. She needed clarity, not panic, not assumptions. Facts. But facts felt impossible to find without destroying lives in the process. That evening, while preparing dinner, Nancy found herself staring at Gabriella again, while the little girl colored beside the kitchen island. The birthmark near her shoulder peeked slightly beneath her pajama sleeve. Nancy looked away immediately. Her grandmother had the same mark. Nancy had it too. And suddenly, memories from years earlier surfaced unexpectedly. Hospital forms, financial desperation, medical donation paperwork signed during her grandmother's final treatments. At the time, Nancy barely thought deeply about it. She only needed money quickly. The fertility donation program paid enough to help cover emergency bills temporarily. That was all she cared about back then. Survival. Helping her grandmother. Nothing more. Nancy gripped the kitchen counter tightly now, because if the clinic truly made a mistake, then the twins. No. Her mind refused finishing the sentence aloud. The emotional weight felt too large, too dangerous. Dinner that night felt strangely tense. Despite everyone trying to behave normally, Henry attempted conversation several times. Melissa barely engaged. Nancy stayed unusually quiet, and the twins sensed it immediately. Children always sensed emotional shifts faster than adults admitted them. Gabriella eventually climbed into Nancy's lap during dinner while eating pieces of cornbread happily. Melissa noticed. Her expression tightened instantly. "Nancy," she said carefully, "put her back in the chair, please." Gabriella frowned immediately. "No." Melissa forced a smile. "Baby, come sit with Mommy." Gabriella looked uncomfortable. Instantly, Nancy gently rubbed the little girl's back. "It's okay, sweetheart." Melissa's eyes flashed with frustration. Henry noticed. Nancy noticed. Even the twins noticed. And the entire table fell emotionally quiet afterward. Later that night, after putting the twins to bed, Nancy walked quietly toward the laundry room carrying folded blankets. The penthouse remained mostly dark, except for dim hallway lighting. As she turned the corner near the office wing, Melissa stepped directly into her path. Nancy stopped immediately. For several long seconds, neither woman spoke. Melissa looked exhausted, not physically, emotionally, like fear had been draining her slowly from the inside. "Can we talk?" Melissa asked quietly. Nancy nodded carefully. Melissa glanced around the hallway first before lowering her voice. "What exactly do you know?" Nancy's heartbeat quickened instantly. "About what?" Melissa looked directly into her eyes. "The phone call." Silence. Nancy felt her stomach tighten. Melissa already knew she overheard. "I wasn't trying to listen," Nancy said softly. "But you did." Nancy stayed quiet. Melissa crossed her arms tightly, like she was holding herself together emotionally. "How much did you hear?" Nancy answered honestly. "Enough." Melissa closed her eyes briefly. And for the first time since Nancy met her, Melissa looked genuinely afraid, not arrogant, not controlling, afraid. Nancy spoke carefully. "What happened at the clinic?" Melissa immediately looked away. That situation was supposed to stay buried forever. Nancy's voice lowered. "Melissa." Tears suddenly filled Melissa's eyes. The sight shocked Nancy deeply, because Melissa rarely allowed emotion to appear naturally. But tonight, there was no performance left. Only fear. "The embryos were switched accidentally during treatment," Melissa whispered painfully. Nancy stopped breathing for a second. Melissa continued before Nancy could speak. "We didn't find out until months later." Nancy's pulse pounded hard now. "And Henry?" Melissa shook her head immediately. "No. Why didn't you tell him?" Melissa laughed weakly through tears. "Because I was terrified." The hallway became painfully quiet. Melissa finally looked back at Nancy again. "You don't understand what his family expected from me." Nancy remained silent. "They already thought I wasn't warm enough. Not maternal enough. Not emotionally soft enough." Her voice cracked. "If they discovered the babies weren't biologically mine too." She couldn't finish the sentence. Nancy suddenly saw the entire situation differently, for one painful moment. Not as manipulation, as fear, deep fear. Melissa wiped beneath her eyes quickly. "Then you started bonding with them." Nancy looked down immediately. "I never meant for that to happen." "I know." That answer surprised her. Melissa took a shaky breath. "You think I didn't notice how peaceful they became around you?" Nancy's chest tightened painfully. "I tried keeping distance, but they loved you naturally." Silence again. Heavy silence. Then Melissa whispered the sentence she clearly hated saying aloud. "They feel safe with you." Nancy closed her eyes briefly, because hearing it directly from Melissa made everything hurt worse. Melissa stepped closer now. "Please." Nancy looked up slowly. "Please don't tell Henry." The vulnerability in her voice sounded almost heartbreaking. I know you probably hate me right now. I don't hate you. Melissa looked stunned hearing that. Nancy meant it. Because, despite everything, she saw brokenness now, not evil, just a woman drowning inside fear and emotional insecurity. Melissa's voice trembled again. If Henry learns the truth, everything falls apart. Nancy looked toward the nursery hallway, instinctively. The twins slept peacefully upstairs, completely unaware of the emotional earthquake waiting beneath their lives. And suddenly, Nancy faced the hardest realization of all. Telling the truth might destroy the children emotionally, but hiding the truth might destroy everybody eventually. The moral weight of that realization crushed her chest painfully. Melissa spoke again quietly. You care about them. Nancy nodded slowly. With everything in me, then protect them. The sentence echoed heavily between them, because now Nancy understood the impossible position she stood in. The truth belonged to Henry, but the consequences would belong to the children, and for the rest of the night, that conflict refused to leave her heart. Sunday arrived carrying an uncomfortable stillness inside the penthouse. Not peace, the kind of silence people created when everybody sensed something was wrong, but nobody wanted to say it first. Nancy barely slept the night before. Melissa's plea continued echoing through her mind endlessly. Please don't tell Henry. At the same time, another painful truth refused to leave her thoughts. Henry deserved honesty. The conflict exhausted her emotionally before the day even began. By early morning, soft sunlight stretched across the kitchen while Nancy prepared breakfast quietly. Usually the twins filled mornings with nonstop energy. Today, even they seemed calmer, more observant. Children always reacted to emotional environments, whether adults admitted it or not. Gabriella sat at the island coloring silently, while Grayson pushed cereal around his bowl distractedly. Nancy glanced toward the staircase. Melissa still hadn't come downstairs. That alone felt unusual. Eventually, Henry entered the kitchen wearing gray sweatpants and a fitted black shirt, looking more rested than he had in weeks. The moment the twins saw him, they brightened instantly. Daddy. Henry smiled immediately and kissed both children before pouring coffee for himself. Then he noticed the atmosphere. His smile faded slightly. You all okay in here? Nancy forced a calm expression. Yes, sir. But Henry looked unconvinced. He studied her carefully for a moment longer than usual. And lately, that had become dangerous. Because every time Henry looked at Nancy now, it felt like he noticed more than before. Not secrets, emotions, changes, weight she struggled hiding. Henry finally sat beside Gabriella. You sure? Nancy nodded quickly while turning back toward the stove. I'm fine. But her voice lacked its usual warmth. Henry noticed immediately. Across the kitchen, Melissa finally appeared moments later dressed beautifully, despite the exhaustion beneath her eyes. Morning, she said softly. Nobody missed the tension in her voice. Henry looked toward her carefully. You okay? Melissa forced a small smile. Just tired. Then her eyes briefly found Nancy's. 1 second, maybe less, but the fear between them felt impossible to miss now. Henry noticed that too. His expression shifted subtly. What's going on? Nothing. Melissa answered too quickly. Nancy stayed silent, and somehow that silence made everything worse. Breakfast became emotionally uncomfortable almost immediately. Henry attempted small conversation several times. The weather, business schedules, the twins' daycare activities. Nobody truly engaged. Melissa kept checking her phone nervously. Nancy barely spoke. Even the twins sensed something strange. Then came the moment Henry couldn't ignore anymore. Gabriella reached for juice too quickly and accidentally knocked her cup sideways across the island. Juice spilled everywhere instantly. Melissa reacted sharply. Gabriella. The little girl flinched immediately. Hard, Nancy saw it. Henry saw it. And Gabriella instantly reached for Nancy instead. That small movement changed the atmosphere completely. Melissa froze. The pain across her face appeared instantly before she could hide it. Nobody's upset, Nancy said gently, while cleaning the spill calmly. Gabriella still clung tightly against her side. Henry slowly looked at Melissa, and for the first time since becoming engaged, he saw genuine emotional distance between Melissa and the twins, clearly. Not assumptions, not suspicions, reality. Melissa stood abruptly from the table. "I need air." Then she disappeared toward the balcony, before anyone could respond. Silence followed immediately afterward. Grayson looked toward Henry quietly. "Mommy mad?" Henry exhaled slowly. "Nobody." But his answer sounded uncertain even to himself. Nancy continued wiping the counter silently, and guilt pressed harder against her chest again, because every passing hour made hiding the truth feel heavier. Later that afternoon, the emotional strain inside the penthouse worsened. Melissa barely interacted with anyone. Henry became quieter. The twins stayed unusually attached to Nancy throughout the day, and Nancy herself felt emotionally trapped between honesty and destruction. By dinner time, tension sat so heavily across the dining room that even the twins stopped talking loudly. Henry finally set down his fork carefully. "Okay." Nobody responded immediately. He looked directly at Melissa first. "What's happening?" Melissa forced a tired smile. "What do you mean?" "This." He gestured lightly around the table. "The silence, the distance. Whatever this is." Melissa laughed weakly. "You're imagining things." "I'm not." Nancy lowered her eyes quietly. Henry looked toward her next. "Nancy?" Her pulse quickened immediately. "Yes, sir?" "You've barely spoken all day." Before Nancy could answer, Melissa interrupted sharply. "She's probably tired." Henry frowned slightly. "I didn't ask you." The room went still. Melissa looked stunned. So did Nancy. Because Henry rarely challenged Melissa directly in front of others. Especially not like this. Melissa slowly placed her fork down. "You know what? Maybe I'm tired of feeling judged inside my own home." "No one's judging you," Henry replied carefully. Melissa looked toward Nancy instantly. "Aren't they?" Nancy spoke softly. "I would never judge you." Melissa laughed bitterly. "Please." The twins looked confused now, uncomfortable. Henry immediately noticed. "That's enough." Melissa pushed her chair backward abruptly. "No, I'm serious. Everybody in this house acts like I'm some terrible person lately." "Melissa, no." Her voice cracked emotionally now. "You look at me differently too." Silence swallowed the room. Because this time, she was right. Henry couldn't deny it anymore. Melissa's eyes watered, instantly realizing he had no response. Then she looked toward Nancy, and for one painful second, all the insecurity inside her became visible openly. "She replaced me without even trying." Nancy looked devastated hearing that. "That's not true." But Melissa shook her head slowly. "You don't even understand what you do to people." Then, before anybody could stop her, Melissa walked out of the dining room completely. The twins looked frightened again. Nancy immediately softened her voice. "It's okay, babies." Henry remained seated silently for several seconds afterward, staring down at the untouched dinner in front of him. Exhaustion covered his face now, not physical exhaustion, emotional exhaustion. Finally, he stood slowly. "I'll check on her later." Nancy nodded quietly. The rest of dinner passed softly after that. The twins eventually relaxed again, once Nancy started talking gently about cartoons and bedtime snacks. Henry watched the interaction carefully from across the room, and once again, that painful realization returned. Nancy brought emotional stability into chaos, naturally. Later that night, after the twins finally fell asleep, Henry found Nancy alone on the penthouse balcony, wrapped in a sweater, staring out at the Chicago skyline. Cold wind moved softly through her curls. For several seconds, he simply stood beside her quietly. The city lights stretched endlessly below them, beautiful, distant, lonely. Henry finally spoke first. "You've been carrying something all day." Nancy's chest tightened instantly. She kept staring forward. "I'm okay." "No, you're not." The honesty in his voice made her emotional immediately, because lately Henry saw through her too easily, and that scared her now more than ever. "You ever feel like truth can hurt people no matter what you choose?" she asked softly. Henry looked toward her carefully. "All the time." Nancy swallowed hard. What if protecting somebody means lying to them? The question lingered heavily between them. Henry leaned against the balcony railing slowly. "My father used to lie constantly," he said quietly. "Business lies, family lies, public lies." Nancy listened silently. "He always claimed it was for protection." Henry gave a tired laugh. Eventually, I realized lies mostly protect the person telling them. The sentence hit Nancy deeply, because part of her knew he was right. Henry looked toward her fully now. Nancy, what's really going on? Her heart pounded instantly. This was the moment where truth sat right at the edge of her lips. One sentence could change everything forever. Nancy finally turned toward him slowly. Tears filled her eyes before she could stop them. Henry's expression softened immediately. "Hey, you're a good father," she whispered emotionally. Confusion crossed his face. "Nancy, you love those babies so much." "I know I do." Her breathing became uneven. Henry stepped slightly closer now, close enough for tension to shift softly between them. Not inappropriate, just deeply human, deeply vulnerable. "You can tell me anything," he said quietly. Nancy looked directly into his eyes, and suddenly the emotional connection between them felt impossible to ignore anymore. The trust, the comfort, the understanding. For one dangerous second, it felt like the rest of the world disappeared around them completely. Henry slowly reached toward her hand. Nancy's breath caught softly, but before either of them could speak again, movement behind the balcony glass stopped everything. Standing silently inside the penthouse, watching them, Nancy stepped backward instantly. Henry turned sharply. Melissa's expression looked emotionally shattered, not angry, destroyed, because she had just witnessed the exact thing she feared most. Not betrayal, emotional closeness, and deep down, all three of them finally understood something irreversible. Nothing inside the penthouse would survive much longer the way it was. By morning, the truth would destroy everything inside the penthouse. Rain slammed violently against the penthouse windows as thunder rolled across downtown Chicago. Everything inside the home felt unstable now. The argument from earlier still hung heavily in the air, while tension stretched painfully between every person in the room. Nancy stood near the fireplace, holding Gabriella tightly against her chest, while Grayson clung nervously beside her. Melissa stood several feet away, breathing unevenly, her mascara slightly smudged beneath frightened eyes. And Henry felt like his entire world had tilted sideways. Nothing about tonight made sense anymore. Not the fear in the twins, not Melissa's reactions, not Nancy's trembling silence. Most of all, not the growing feeling inside his chest, warning him something terrible had been hidden from him for a very long time. "Somebody needs to explain what's happening," Henry said sharply. Nobody answered immediately. The fireplace crackled softly behind Nancy, while rain hammered harder against the glass walls. Melissa wiped beneath her eyes quickly. "She's manipulating you." Nancy looked emotionally exhausted now. "No, sir," she whispered. "I swear, I never wanted this." Henry turned toward her instantly. "Wanted what?" Nancy hesitated, and that hesitation nearly broke the last bit of patience holding him together. "Nancy." Her eyes filled with tears immediately. Melissa suddenly stepped forward. "Stop this right now." Henry looked toward her. "Then, tell me the truth." Complete silence swallowed the penthouse. Even the twins stopped crying briefly. Henry stared directly at Melissa now, and for the first time since he met her, he saw pure fear, not embarrassment, not frustration. Fear, real fear. Nancy slowly lowered her eyes, before reaching into the pocket of her apron with trembling fingers. Melissa noticed instantly. "No." Her voice cracked immediately. "Nancy, don't." Henry frowned deeply. What is she talking about? Nancy carefully pulled out folded papers. The sight alone made Melissa panic visibly. "You had no right," Melissa shouted suddenly. Gabriella flinched hard against Nancy's chest. "Nobody yellin', baby," Nancy whispered softly, while gently rubbing the little girl's back. Henry stared at the papers. "What are those?" Nancy looked devastated. "I found them after Melissa dropped them near the office hallway." Melissa shook her head rapidly. "Henry, please." But Henry already reached forward and took the papers from Nancy's trembling hands. The second he unfolded them, everything changed. Medical records, laboratory forms, DNA reports, fertility clinic documentation. Henry's breathing slowed unnaturally. His eyes scanned the pages once, then again, then a third time, as if his mind refused accepting the words sitting directly in front of him. Melissa took one shaky step forward. "I can explain," but Henry barely heard her, because one sentence kept repeating loudly inside his head. "Paternal match confirmed." Henry looked physically sick. "The twins are biologically mine," he whispered slowly. Melissa burst into tears immediately. "Yes." Henry looked back down at the papers again. Then another line hit him. "Maternal record inconsistency detected." His face drained completely of color. "What does this mean?" Nobody answered. Nancy closed her eyes briefly. Melissa cried harder. Henry looked between both women now, while confusion turned rapidly into horror. "What does this mean?" Melissa shook violently. "It wasn't supposed to happen this way." Henry's voice rose sharply. "What happened?" The twins started crying again instantly, from the tension exploding through the room. Gabriella buried her face deeper against Nancy's shoulder, while Grayson clung tightly to Nancy's leg. Henry noticed everything, every reaction, every movement, and suddenly nothing inside his own home felt familiar anymore. Melissa tried stepping closer carefully. "Henry, listen to me." "No." His voice cracked painfully. "No more half-truths." Melissa stopped immediately. Henry held the document so tightly, the pages trembled in his hands. "How long have you known?" Melissa couldn't answer. That silence told him enough. His breathing became uneven now. "You lied to me for years." "I was scared." The words exploded from Melissa emotionally. Tears streamed heavily down her face now. "You don't understand the pressure I was under." Henry stared at her in disbelief. "Pressure? My family, your family, the media. Everybody expected perfection." Melissa cried. "Perfect engagement, perfect children, perfect image." Henry looked shattered. "So, you built our entire life on lies?" "No." Melissa screamed emotionally. "I loved them." Gabriella cried harder at the sound. Nancy instinctively rocked both twins gently while trying to calm them. "It's okay, babies. It's okay." Henry turned toward the children automatically, and once again something struck him painfully, even during complete chaos. The twins reached for Nancy first. Not Melissa, Nancy. Melissa noticed Henry noticing it. That realization crushed her visibly. "I tried," she whispered weakly. "God knows I tried." Henry looked toward her again slowly. "Tried what?" "To become the mother they deserved." The sentence hit the room heavily. Nancy lowered her eyes immediately. Henry's hands trembled harder around the paperwork now. His mind replayed years of memories differently in seconds. Melissa, struggling emotionally with the twins, Nancy naturally calming them. The strange distance, the awkwardness, the emotional disconnect he kept trying to ignore. And suddenly, all those memories felt terrifyingly clear. Henry backed away slowly toward the bar area, like he needed physical distance from the truth itself. "You let me believe." He stopped speaking briefly, overwhelmed emotionally. "You let me build my entire family around something false." Melissa sobbed openly now. "I thought I could fix it before you ever found out." "Fix what?" Silence. Nancy looked emotionally torn apart beside the fireplace. Melissa finally whispered, "The clinic made a mistake." Henry stared at her. "What mistake?" Melissa looked toward Nancy instinctively. And that single glance changed everything. Henry followed her eyes slowly, then looked at Nancy, then back at the paperwork, then back at Nancy again. A cold feeling moved through his entire body. No. The word barely left his mouth. Nancy's tears finally slipped down her cheeks. Henry's pulse slammed hard inside his chest now. "No." Melissa covered her face, crying harder. Henry looked directly at Nancy, and for the first time, he truly looked. Not as the children's caregiver, not as the woman who brought warmth into the penthouse, but as somebody connected to this nightmare in a way he still couldn't fully understand yet. Nancy's breathing shook unevenly. "I never wanted to hurt anybody." Henry's voice cracked painfully. "Nancy, what is this?" Thunder shook the windows violently. The twins cried softly against Nancy, while Melissa completely broke down near the couch. And in the center of the emotional destruction standing inside that penthouse, Henry realized his perfect life had already collapsed. He just hadn't known it until now. The penthouse felt painfully quiet after Melissa admitted the clinic made a mistake. Rain continued crashing against the windows outside, but inside the room nobody moved for several long seconds. Henry stood frozen near the bar area, still gripping the documents tightly in his trembling hands. Melissa sat collapsed against the couch, crying openly. Nancy remained near the fireplace, holding both twins, while tears rolled silently down her face. And somewhere inside, the middle of all that silence, the truth waited, heavy, terrifying, unavoidable. Henry slowly looked up again. His voice sounded weaker now, more human than Nancy had ever heard before. What mistake? Nobody answered immediately. Melissa covered her mouth, trying to stop crying. Nancy's chest tightened, painfully, because she already knew this moment would destroy everything. Henry stepped forward slowly. His eyes moved between both women again, then finally stopped on Nancy, and suddenly, something inside his expression changed. Recognition, not full understanding yet, but recognition, like pieces inside his mind, had started arranging themselves into something horrifying. The DNA records. Henry whispered unevenly, "Why would your name be connected to any of this?" Nancy's breathing shook harder instantly. Melissa closed her eyes completely. Henry noticed that too. No. He stared directly at Melissa now. "No, tell me I'm wrong." Melissa cried harder. "Henry." His voice rose sharply this time. "Tell me." The twins startled instantly from the sound. Grayson buried himself tighter against Nancy's side, while Gabriella whimpered softly. Nancy gently rubbed their backs, trying to calm them. But her own hands trembled uncontrollably now. Henry looked shattered already, but somehow Nancy knew the worst part hadn't even reached him yet. He turned toward her again slowly. "Nancy." Her eyes filled completely, and when she finally spoke, her voice barely came out above a whisper. "It was me." Silence. Complete silence. Even the rain outside suddenly felt distant. Henry stared at her without blinking, like his mind physically refused processing the words. Nancy lowered her eyes briefly, before forcing herself to continue. "I donated eggs anonymously years ago." Henry still didn't speak, didn't move, didn't breathe normally. Nancy swallowed painfully. "My grandmother was sick. The hospital bills kept growing, and I didn't know how else to help her." Melissa cried softly in the background, but Henry barely seemed aware she existed anymore. His entire focus remained locked onto Nancy. "The clinic used anonymous donors," Nancy continued shakily. "I never knew where anything went afterward." Henry's face slowly lost all remaining color. "No." Nancy's tears fell harder now. "I swear to you, I didn't know at first." Henry looked down at the papers again, like he desperately wanted reality to change if he read them enough times. Then suddenly, memories began crashing through his mind violently. Gabriella's smile, Grayson's expressions, the emotional connection, the birthmark, the warmth, the instinctive trust, and most painful of all, the feeling that the twins always seemed emotionally tied to Nancy in ways nobody could explain. Henry looked up slowly again, and now he saw it, not imagination, not coincidence. Pieces of Nancy existed inside both children. The realization hit him so hard, he physically stepped backward. "Oh my God." Melissa stood suddenly from the couch. "Henry, please listen." "No." His voice cracked sharply. "No, don't touch me right now." Melissa stopped immediately. Henry ran one hand over his face, trying to breathe properly. "You knew?" Melissa broke down instantly again. "Yes." The answer shattered him visibly. "You knew this entire time?" "We found out after the pregnancy." Melissa cried. "The clinic contacted me privately." Henry looked sick. "And you said nothing?" "I was terrified." "You let me raise children beside their biological mother without telling me the truth?" Nancy immediately shook her head emotionally. "I never wanted to take your family away." Henry looked toward her instantly. "You knew too?" Nancy's expression broke completely. "Not at first, then quietly, but eventually, I started noticing things." Henry's chest rose unevenly now. "The resemblance." Nancy nodded through tears. "The birthmark on Gabriella." Henry closed his eyes briefly. Nancy continued softly. "Then I overheard Melissa talking about the clinic." Melissa covered her face again, crying harder. Henry stared at her in disbelief. You begged her to stay quiet. Melissa's silence answered him. The room suddenly felt emotionally unbearable. Henry walked several steps away again toward the windows overlooking Chicago's storm-covered skyline. For years, he believed his life was stable, carefully built, controlled. Now everything felt fragile, false. Nancy carefully placed the twins onto the large couch nearby, while they continued crying softly from all the tension around them. Gabriella immediately reached back toward her. Nancy. The sound nearly broke Henry completely, because even now, even during emotional chaos, the little girl instinctively searched for her real mother, without understanding why. Henry pressed both hands against his head briefly. This can't be real. Nancy stepped forward slightly. Henry, no. His voice cracked painfully again. Don't say my name right now. I can't. He stopped speaking entirely. Emotion overwhelmed him too quickly. For several seconds, he simply stared at the floor trying to steady himself. Then finally, he looked toward Nancy again, and the devastation inside his eyes nearly destroyed her. You held this inside for years? Nancy nodded weakly. I never wanted the twins hurt. Henry laughed once bitterly through visible pain. So everybody decided lying was protection? The sentence hit both women hard, because, deep down, he was right. Melissa spoke through tears. I thought if I loved them enough eventually, it wouldn't matter. Henry looked toward her slowly. But it did matter. I know. You built our engagement around a secret. I know. You let me believe. You trusted me. Melissa cried harder. I did love you. Henry's face twisted painfully, but not enough to tell me the truth. Silence again. Nancy watched him carefully now. And for the first time since she met Henry Monroe, the billionaire looked completely powerless. Not financially. Emotionally. Money couldn't help him here. Status couldn't protect him here. Nothing in his world prepared him for this kind of betrayal. Henry suddenly looked toward the twins again. Grayson had fallen asleep curled beside Gabriella from emotional exhaustion, while Nancy gently covered them with a blanket. The sight softened something inside Henry briefly, because despite all the lies, those children were innocent, completely innocent. Nancy noticed the shift immediately. You're still their father. Henry looked at her slowly, and somehow that sentence hurt him most of all, because despite everything, Nancy still prioritized the children emotionally before herself. Even now, even after carrying this burden alone for so long, Melissa suddenly whispered weakly, I never meant for things to become this ugly. Henry laughed painfully again. Ugly? He looked around the room emotionally shattered. Melissa, my entire life just changed in one night. Melissa cried silently. Nancy remained standing near the twins, feeling emotionally hollow herself, because now the truth finally existed openly inside the penthouse. No more hiding, no more pretending, no more carefully avoiding reality. And somehow the honesty felt both freeing and devastating at the same time. Henry slowly sank onto the couch opposite the twins, looking completely drained. The paperwork still rested in his hands, wrinkled now from how tightly he'd held it. After several long seconds, he finally looked toward Nancy one more time, and this time his voice sounded heartbreakingly small. All this time. Nancy's tears fell harder. I'm sorry. Henry stared at the sleeping twins quietly, then at Nancy, and suddenly, the emotional resemblance between all three of them became impossible to ignore anymore. Not just physically, emotionally too. The warmth, the softness, the instinctive connection, it had all been standing directly in front of him the entire time, and now that he finally saw it, he knew he would never be able to unsee it again. The storm outside finally began slowing sometime after midnight, but inside the penthouse, emotional destruction still sat heavily in every room. Nobody knew what to say anymore. The truth had finally surfaced completely, and now, all three adults stood trapped inside the aftermath of it. Henry remained seated on the couch, staring silently at the sleeping twins. The paperwork still rested loosely in his hands, unread now, meaningless now, because the truth no longer lived inside documents. It lived inside every memory, replaying through his mind. Melissa sat near the fireplace, quietly crying into trembling hands. Nancy stood beside the twins, adjusting their blanket gently, while emotional exhaustion covered her face completely. Nobody looked untouched anymore, not even slightly. For several long minutes, only the sound of rain against glass filled the penthouse. Then Henry finally spoke, softly, almost to himself. I spent years trying to build the perfect family. Neither woman interrupted him. Henry laughed once under his breath. Not humor, pain. I thought if I worked hard enough, earned enough, protected everybody enough. He swallowed heavily. Everything would stay together. Melissa closed her eyes tightly, hearing the hurt in his voice. Henry slowly looked toward her, but none of it was real. Melissa shook her head immediately through tears. No, don't say that. How can I not? It was real to me. Henry's jaw tightened painfully. Then why lie? Melissa wiped beneath her eyes shakily. Because I knew what people already thought about me. Nancy stayed silent nearby. Melissa looked toward the windows, avoiding Henry's eyes now. Your mother never believed I was warm enough for you. Her voice cracked slightly. Your business friends treated me like decoration at events. She laughed bitterly through tears. Even parenting magazines made women like me feel defective. Henry listened quietly. Melissa continued speaking before fear could stop her. Everywhere I looked, people acted like motherhood was supposed to come naturally. She pressed trembling fingers against her forehead, but for me, it didn't. The room remained painfully still. Melissa's voice softened further, and when the clinic called, she stopped briefly, trying to breathe steadily. I panicked. Henry stared at her silently. They told me there had been a mistake during implantation. Tears rolled heavily down her cheeks again. At first, I wanted to tell you immediately. Nancy looked toward Melissa slowly, but then I imagined losing everything. Henry's face hardened emotionally. So you chose lies instead. Melissa cried harder. I chose survival. That sentence hung heavily inside the room. Because painful as it sounded, Nancy finally understood exactly what Melissa meant. Fear had controlled every decision afterward. Fear of judgment, fear of abandonment, fear of emotional failure. Melissa looked toward the sleeping twins again. You think I didn't love them? Henry answered honestly. I think you tried. The sentence broke her completely. Melissa covered her face, crying harder than before, because deep down, she knew it was true. She tried to become emotionally natural, tried to feel maternal instinct the way other women described it, tried to build emotional closeness that never seemed to come easily, and every time the twins instinctively chose Nancy instead. Melissa felt herself failing more. Nancy slowly sat down near the edge of the couch now, emotionally drained herself. I never wanted them caught in the middle. Melissa looked toward her weakly. I know. Henry rubbed one hand over his face again, exhausted. For the first time in years, he looked older than his age. Not physically, emotionally, because betrayal aged people differently. Melissa suddenly whispered, You probably hate me. Henry stayed quiet for several seconds before answering. No. The answer shocked both women. Henry leaned back slowly against the couch cushions. I'm angry. His voice sounded hollow now. I'm hurt. I don't even know who I am inside this situation anymore. Melissa cried silently. But I don't hate you. Nancy watched him carefully. And once again she saw something different about Henry Monroe than the world usually saw. Most wealthy men Henry's status would have exploded publicly by now, threatened lawyers, destroyed reputations, humiliated people emotionally, but Henry looked broken more than furious. That said something important about his character. Melissa noticed it too, which somehow made her cry harder, because kindness often hurt more than cruelty when guilt already existed. Henry slowly looked toward Nancy next, and once again, that emotional resemblance between her and the twins became impossible to ignore. Not simply appearance anymore, behavior, gentleness, the way Gabriella curled inward while sleeping, the way Grayson frowned slightly during dreams. Tiny things Henry suddenly recognized inside Nancy too. The realization emotionally overwhelmed him again. My God, he whispered quietly. Nancy lowered her eyes immediately. Henry stood slowly and walked toward the massive windows overlooking the city. Chicago lights stretched endlessly beneath the storm clouds outside, beautiful, cold, distant, He spent years chasing power inside those buildings, years believing success could create safety. But tonight proved something brutal. Money protected appearances better than people. Henry looked toward his reflection in the glass, then finally spoke again. I kept thinking something felt emotionally wrong inside this house. Melissa closed her eyes painfully, but every time I questioned it, Henry laughed weakly. I convinced myself I was overthinking. Nancy's chest tightened, hearing the exhaustion in his voice. Henry turned around slowly now. The twins always felt safer with you. Nancy's eyes watered instantly. I tried creating distance. I know. Melissa looked down immediately, because, now, the truth stood fully exposed between them. Children recognized emotional safety naturally, and, despite Melissa's efforts, the twins found that safety in Nancy from the beginning. Not because Melissa was evil, because emotional connection could never be forced. Henry walked slowly back toward the couch, where the twins slept peacefully, unaware their entire world had shifted forever. He carefully brushed Gabriella's curls away from her forehead, then looked toward Nancy again. You protected them. Nancy swallowed hard. I tried. Even now she spoke like somebody carrying responsibility instead of entitlement. That broke Henry emotionally, in ways he couldn't explain. Because Nancy never once used the truth to gain power inside the house. Never manipulated him, never attempted replacing Melissa. She simply loved the children quietly, while carrying unbearable emotional weight alone. Melissa finally spoke again weakly. She deserves blame too. Nancy looked stunned immediately. No. You knew eventually. And I stayed because I was trying to protect everybody. Henry looked toward Nancy carefully, and deep down, he believed her completely. That realization changed something irreversible inside him. Melissa noticed it instantly. The trust, the emotional certainty, and suddenly, she understood the full truth she spent months trying to avoid. Henry no longer looked at Nancy like staff. He looked at her like someone emotionally essential. Melissa's voice trembled again. That's it, isn't it? Nobody answered. But silence answered enough. Melissa laughed weakly through tears. All this time I kept competing against something impossible. Nancy frowned softly. What do you mean? Melissa looked directly at her. You gave this house warmth, without even trying. The words sat heavily inside the room, because everybody knew they were true. Nancy looked heartbroken hearing them aloud. Not victorious, heartbroken. Henry slowly sat back down beside the twins again, completely drained emotionally now. The penthouse itself suddenly felt different somehow. Not glamorous, not powerful, just painfully honest. No more pretending, no more carefully managed appearances, no more perfect family illusion, protecting everybody from uncomfortable truths. Only reality remained now. Messy, emotional, human. Melissa finally stood slowly from the fireplace area. For a second, she looked around the penthouse quietly. The expensive furniture, the designer artwork, the beautiful skyline view, all the things she once believed represented success. And suddenly, none of it mattered anymore, because emotional emptiness had quietly destroyed everything long before tonight. Melissa looked toward Henry one final time, and for the first time since their engagement began, she realized she had already lost him emotionally long before the truth surfaced. Not to another woman, to honesty itself. That realization broke the final piece of composure she had left. Nancy gently adjusted the blanket covering the twins again while thunder rumbled softly farther away now. And deep inside the heavy silence filling the penthouse, everybody finally understood the same painful truth. The penthouse had finally stopped pretending. The penthouse felt unfamiliar during the days that followed the truth. Not louder, not colder, just emotionally exposed. For years, the home had operated like a carefully controlled performance where everybody protected appearances instead of honesty. Now the performance was gone, and without it, silence moved differently through the rooms. Henry barely slept the first 2 nights after the revelation. Most evenings he remained awake near the living room windows long after the city lights dimmed beneath the Chicago skyline. Sometimes he reviewed paperwork from the fertility clinic again, even though he already knew the truth completely. Other times, he simply sat there staring into nothing, while thoughts exhausted him emotionally. Nancy gave him space. Melissa avoided long conversations. And the twins. The twins continued loving everyone without fully understanding why the adults around them suddenly looked sad all the time. One quiet morning, Nancy entered the kitchen, carrying Gabriella, while Grayson followed behind, rubbing sleepy eyes. Henry already sat at the island nursing untouched coffee. He looked exhausted. Not physically, emotionally. The second Gabriella noticed him, her face brightened. "Daddy." Henry immediately opened his arms. The little girl climbed into his lap without hesitation, and for a moment, something inside him softened again. Children had a way of pulling people back toward life, even when pain tried consuming everything else. Grayson climbed beside him next. Henry kissed both their foreheads quietly. Nancy watched silently while preparing breakfast. For the first time in days, nobody argued, nobody defended themselves, nobody tried controlling the emotional atmosphere. The honesty inside the house hurt. But it also felt strangely peaceful compared to pretending. Henry looked toward Nancy carefully after several minutes. "Have you eaten?" Nancy seemed slightly surprised by the question. "Not yet. You should sit down for a minute." Her instinct was to refuse politely. That had always been the boundary. But lately, boundaries inside the penthouse felt emotionally complicated. Nancy slowly sat at the opposite side of the island, while the twins continued eating fruit beside Henry. The scene looked painfully normal. And maybe that was the strangest part of all, because despite the revelation, the emotional connection between everybody remained real, messy, complicated, but real. Melissa entered the kitchen quietly moments later. The room shifted emotionally immediately, not with hostility, sadness. Melissa wore simple clothes now, instead of carefully styled outfits. No makeup, no polished social smile. The woman standing there looked emotionally stripped down, compared to the version everyone usually saw publicly. She paused briefly, seeing everybody together, then softly said, "Morning." Henry nodded once. Nancy answered respectfully, "Good morning, Ma." Melissa's eyes lowered slightly hearing the title, because now, everything about their relationship felt painfully different. The twins greeted her politely, but Gabriella still remained curled comfortably beside Henry, instead of reaching toward Melissa. Melissa noticed. The pain crossed her face instantly before she hid it again. Henry saw it too, and for the first time since the truth surfaced, he felt something unexpected toward Melissa. Not anger, compassion, because, despite the lies, she was hurting too, deeply. Melissa slowly poured coffee, before speaking quietly. "I spoke with the clinic lawyers this morning." Nancy looked up slightly. Henry remained silent. Melissa wrapped both hands around the mug nervously. They agreed to keep everything private. Henry finally spoke. "I'm not interested in public scandals." Melissa swallowed hard. "I know." Silence followed briefly. Then Henry added quietly, "The children deserve peace." Melissa's eyes filled instantly, because, even after everything, Henry still prioritized protecting the twins instead of destroying her publicly. That kindness nearly broke her emotionally. Later that afternoon, Melissa asked Henry to speak privately inside the office. Nancy stayed upstairs with the twins, while rain tapped softly against the nursery windows. Gabriella colored beside the rug while Grayson built crooked block towers nearby. Nancy watched them quietly. And for the first time since the truth exploded, exhaustion finally started catching up with her emotionally. Because now, reality sat directly in front of her every moment. The twins were biologically hers. Henry knew. Melissa knew. And somehow the knowledge made everything feel both closer and more distant at the same time. Nancy looked toward the packed suitcase resting near her bedroom doorway. Small, simple, prepared quietly that morning, because deep down, she already knew she couldn't stay much longer. Not after everything. No matter how much the twins loved her, no matter how emotionally connected the house had become. Eventually, the situation would grow too painful for everyone. Nancy closed her eyes briefly. The thought of leaving the twins shattered her chest, but staying felt dangerous too. Downstairs inside the office, Melissa sat across from Henry, struggling to maintain composure. "I'm leaving." Henry looked at her quietly, not shocked, just tired. Melissa laughed weakly through tears. I guess we both knew this part was coming. Henry leaned back silently. For several long seconds neither spoke. Then Melissa whispered, I never wanted to become this person. Henry answered honestly, I don't think you did. That response emotionally destroyed what little composure she had left. Melissa wiped tears quickly. I start therapy next week. Henry nodded slowly. I already arranged everything privately. Melissa looked stunned briefly. You still did that for me? Henry's expression softened with sadness. You need help healing too. The compassion in his voice hurt more than anger would have. Because Melissa understood something painful now, Henry truly did care about people deeply. And she lost him anyway. Melissa looked toward the office windows quietly. You know the worst part? Henry stayed silent. I spent so much time trying to become the perfect woman for your world. Her voice cracked. I forgot how to be emotionally honest inside it. Henry lowered his eyes briefly, because part of him understood exactly what she meant. Wealthy circles rewarded appearances constantly. Successful couples learned how to smile publicly while falling apart privately, and somewhere along the way, their relationship stopped becoming emotionally real. Melissa finally stood slowly. When I leave here, she swallowed painfully. Please don't let the children grow up hating me. Henry looked toward her immediately. That won't happen. Tears filled Melissa's eyes again. Thank you. That evening, Melissa quietly packed the last of her belongings while the penthouse remained unusually calm. No screaming, no dramatic revenge, just consequences, human consequences. Nancy stayed upstairs most of the evening, giving Melissa privacy. But eventually, Melissa appeared near the nursery doorway, carrying a small bag. Nancy looked up immediately. The twins sat nearby, watching cartoons quietly. For a second, neither woman spoke. Then Melissa looked toward the children. I came to say goodbye for tonight. Gabriella looked confused instantly. You leaving? Melissa smiled weakly through visible sadness. Just for a little while, baby. The little girl climbed off the bed slowly and hugged Melissa carefully. That simple hug shattered her emotionally. Melissa held Gabriella tightly while tears rolled silently down her face. Then Grayson hugged her too. Nancy looked away briefly, giving Melissa privacy during the painful moment. Because regardless of biology, Melissa still loved those children in the only way she knew how. After several emotional minutes, Melissa finally stood again near the doorway. Her eyes met Nancy's quietly. I hope you protect them. Nancy nodded softly. With everything I have. Melissa believed her. That was the strange thing. Despite jealousy, fear, and emotional damage, Melissa trusted Nancy with the twins completely. And maybe she always had. Melissa looked toward the hallway one final time before leaving the nursery quietly. Nancy watched the doorway long after she disappeared. Because, deep down, everybody understood something important now. The truth had not created a perfect ending. It simply gave everybody a chance to stop living dishonestly. Later that night, after the twins finally slept, Nancy quietly zipped her suitcase closed. Then she sat beside the edge of the bed, staring silently at the nursery monitor. Grayson sleeping peacefully. Gabriella curled around a stuffed bear. Nancy's eyes filled slowly. Because tomorrow, she planned to leave too. The penthouse felt unusually quiet the next morning. Not tense like before, not emotionally explosive, just heavy. Like everybody inside the home understood life had permanently changed, and there was no returning to who they used to be. Sunlight stretched softly across the floor-to-ceiling windows while Chicago traffic moved far below the penthouse in distant waves. Nancy stood alone inside her bedroom, staring at the packed suitcase near the door. She barely slept. Every few hours she woke, instinctively checking the nursery monitor beside the bed, watching Grayson shift beneath blankets, watching Gabriella hug her stuffed bear while sleeping, memorizing little moments she feared losing forever. Nancy slowly closed the suitcase completely. Her chest tightened painfully, because leaving the penthouse felt like tearing herself away from part of her own heart. But staying felt impossible too. Too complicated, too emotional, too dangerous. The truth had already broken enough people. Nancy quietly wiped beneath her eyes before lifting the suitcase handle. Then she stopped one final time, looking around the room. 2 years. That room once represented survival, a job, temporary stability. After losing her grandmother, now it carried memories everywhere. Late-night lullabies, tiny footsteps running through hallways, burnt pancakes, kitchen laughter, family dinners, and somewhere along the way, Henry Monroe stopped feeling like an employer. That realization scared her deeply now. Nancy took one slow breath and stepped into the hallway. The penthouse remained silent. Melissa had already left earlier that morning quietly, while the twins still slept. No dramatic goodbye. No reporters. No public humiliation. Just sadness. Human sadness. Nancy walked toward the nursery one last time before leaving. Inside, Grayson and Gabriella still slept peacefully curled beneath blankets. Nancy sat beside them carefully. Her fingers gently brushed Gabriella's curls away from her forehead. Then Grayson's cheek. The emotional weight inside her chest nearly crushed her. "I love y'all so much," she whispered softly. Tears rolled silently down her face. Because, no matter what biology revealed, her love for them had already become part of who she was, long before the truth surfaced. Gabriella stirred sleepily. "Nancy?" Nancy smiled through tears immediately. "Hey, baby." The little girl rubbed her eyes slowly. "You crying?" Nancy laughed softly. "Little bit." Gabriella sat up immediately and wrapped tiny arms around her neck. That nearly destroyed Nancy completely. "You stay?" Nancy closed her eyes, tightly holding her, because answering felt impossible. Grayson woke moments later too. The second he saw the suitcase near the doorway, his little face changed. "You going somewhere?" Nancy swallowed painfully. "I gotta leave for a while." "No." The answer came instantly from both twins. Nancy's chest ached harder. Gabriella started crying first, then Grayson. Nancy pulled both children close, trying to calm them, while tears streamed harder down her own face. "It's okay, babies. It's okay." But honestly, nothing about this felt okay. Several minutes later, after finally settling the twins with cartoons and breakfast downstairs, Nancy quietly wheeled the suitcase toward the private elevator. Every step felt heavier than the last. She kept telling herself this was the right decision, the mature decision, the safe decision, because eventually, emotions inside the penthouse would become too complicated for everyone, especially the children. Nancy pressed the elevator button quietly. The doors opened almost immediately. She stepped inside slowly, then pressed the lobby button. The doors began sliding shut. "Nancy." Henry's voice stopped everything. Nancy looked up instantly. Henry walked toward the elevator quickly, wearing dark sweatpants and a black sweater, his hair slightly messy like he hadn't slept much either. The elevator doors remained open between them. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then, Henry's eyes lowered toward the suitcase. "You're leaving." Nancy forced herself to nod. "I think it's best." Henry stepped inside the elevator before the doors could close. Best for who? Nancy looked away immediately. Everybody. The elevator remained motionless now. Neither of them touched the buttons again. Chicago morning light reflected softly across the mirrored walls surrounding them. And suddenly, the small space felt emotionally overwhelming. Henry stared at her quietly. "You were really gonna disappear without talking to me first?" Nancy's voice trembled slightly. "I didn't want to make things harder." "Harder?" Henry laughed weakly under his breath. "Nancy, my life already exploded." Pain crossed both their faces instantly. Nancy lowered her eyes. "I never wanted to hurt you." Henry answered immediately. "I know." That response broke something inside her emotionally, because after everything, Henry still looked at her with trust. Not blame, trust. Henry stepped slightly closer now. The twins are upstairs crying. Nancy closed her eyes briefly. "Please don't tell me that. They don't want you to leave." Nancy's breathing became uneven again. "Henry, no." His voice softened painfully. "For once, don't run from this conversation." Silence filled the elevator heavily. Henry looked exhausted, emotionally raw. Like the billionaire image, finally disappeared completely, and honestly, Nancy had never seen him more human than right now. Henry rubbed one hand slowly across his face. "You know what hurts most?" Nancy looked up carefully. "I spent years believing this penthouse was a home, because it looked expensive enough to become one. His voice cracked slightly. But it never felt alive until you arrived. Nancy's tears returned instantly. Henry continued quietly. You brought warmth into rooms I didn't even realize felt empty. The emotional honesty in his voice shook her completely. Nancy tried looking away again, but Henry stepped closer gently. No more pretending. That sentence echoed softly between them. No more pretending. No more hiding emotions behind status, titles, or fear. Nancy's voice trembled badly now. I tried so hard to keep boundaries. I know. I never planned any of this. I know. I swear, I never wanted to come between you and Melissa. Henry nodded slowly. I know that too. The compassion in his voice broke her remaining emotional control completely. Nancy covered her mouth briefly, trying not to cry harder. Henry watched her carefully. And suddenly, every small moment between them over the past 2 years replayed differently inside his mind. Late-night conversations in the kitchen, her laughing with the twins, the warmth she carried naturally, the peace he always felt around her. And finally, Henry stopped fighting the truth, sitting inside his chest. He loved her, not recklessly, not suddenly, slowly, patiently, through ordinary moments that became emotionally unforgettable. Henry stepped even closer now, close enough for Nancy to feel the warmth of him beside her. You know why the twins always felt safe with you? He asked softly. Nancy looked at him through tears. Because the first did too. The sentence shattered her emotionally. Nancy cried openly now. Not quiet tears anymore. Years of grief, exhaustion, loneliness, and emotional restraint finally broke loose all at once. Henry gently held her arms instinctively, and for several seconds, neither spoke. They simply stood there, breathing through the emotional weight together. Then Nancy whispered the truth she spent months trying to bury. I love them so much. Henry's eyes softened deeply. I know, and I'm scared. So am I. Nancy looked at him fully now. No walls left between them anymore. No secrets. No carefully managed distance. Only honesty remained. Henry lifted one hand slowly against her cheek. Gentle, careful, giving her every chance to step away. Nancy didn't move, because deep down, she had been emotionally falling for him long before the truth surfaced too. Not for his money, not for status. For the man who stayed awake during fevers, who listened sincerely, who laughed loudly in kitchens over burnt pancakes, who wanted real family more than perfect appearances. Henry's voice dropped softly. I don't want this house without you in it. Nancy's breath caught painfully. Then finally, after months of restraint, grief, truth, and emotional survival, Henry kissed her, softly, not dramatic, not rushed, just honest, the kind of kiss built through trust instead of fantasy. Nancy kissed him back through tears while the elevator stood motionless around them, and for the first time since the storm began destroying their carefully constructed lives, something inside both of them finally felt peaceful. When they slowly pulled apart, neither spoke immediately. They didn't need to, because the truth already existed clearly between them now. No more secrets. 8 months later, the penthouse no longer felt like a museum pretending to be a home. It finally felt lived in. Real laughter echoed through the hallways almost daily now. Music played during breakfast again. Tiny shoes constantly appeared in random places across the marble floors. And somehow, the massive luxury penthouse overlooking downtown Chicago finally carried something it lacked for years before. Peace. Not perfect peace. Real peace. The kind built slowly through honesty, healing, patience, and emotional safety. Sunday evenings became the loudest part of the week, especially dinner time. Henry actually looked forward to coming home now, instead of hiding inside endless business meetings. That alone shocked people around him. For years, work consumed almost every part of his life. Now, he canceled meetings more often, ignored social invitations without guilt, even turned down certain business dinners just to stay home with the twins. Because somewhere along the way, Henry finally realized something powerful. Success meant nothing if the people you loved emotionally felt alone beside you. That lesson changed him permanently. One Sunday evening, Laughter filled the kitchen while Nancy stood near the stove pretending to argue with Grayson over cornbread pieces. You already had 2. No, I didn't. Yes, you did. That was yesterday. Nancy stared at him dramatically. Boy, don't start lying this young. Gabriella burst into loud laughter from the kitchen island, while Henry nearly choked on sweet tea laughing beside her. The atmosphere felt warm, easy, alive, and most importantly, nobody inside the house was pretending anymore. Nancy moved comfortably through the kitchen, now wearing one of Henry's oversized hoodies, while music played softly nearby. No awkward distance remained between them, no emotional confusion, just honesty, slowly earned honesty. Henry watched her quietly while helping Gabriella finish homework at the island. Even after all these months, moments still hit him unexpectedly sometimes. Tiny moments. Nancy laughing, the twins clinging to her naturally, the sound of home finally existing around him. And every single time, the same realization returned. He almost lost this life because everybody feared truth more than pain. Nancy suddenly looked toward him. You daydreaming again? Henry smirked slightly. Maybe. Gabriella pointed dramatically. Daddy been smiling all day. Nancy laughed softly. Uh-oh. Henry shook his head. I live with 3 people who roast me constantly. You surviving though? Nancy teased. Barely. The twins laughed loudly again. That sound became Henry's favorite part of life. Not applause at business conferences, not magazine covers, not private jets. This family noise. The kind he never experienced growing up. The kind money alone could never purchase. Later that evening after dinner, the twins built blanket forts inside the living room, while Nancy cleaned dishes and Henry dried them beside her. The teamwork felt natural now. Comfortable. Henry handed her another plate. You know something? Nancy glanced toward him. What? I used to hate Sundays. She looked surprised. Why? Because Sunday nights meant Monday was coming. Nancy laughed softly. That's everybody. No, Henry replied honestly. I mean, I genuinely hated being home. The admission carried emotional weight between them, because Nancy understood exactly what he meant. This penthouse once looked beautiful while feeling emotionally empty. Now children ran through hallways laughing loudly, while music drifted through rooms at random hours. The entire atmosphere transformed. Not because of luxury upgrades, because people inside the home finally stopped hiding from each other. Nancy dried another plate quietly. You changed too. Henry smiled faintly. Yeah? You breathe differently now. He laughed softly. That's a very grandma-style observation. Nancy pointed proudly. She raised me correctly. Henry looked at her carefully after that. And once again, gratitude filled his chest, unexpectedly, because Nancy brought emotional warmth into his life, long before romance ever entered it. She healed spaces inside him she never even knew existed. Across the living room, Grayson suddenly yelled dramatically from the blanket fort, "Family meeting." Gabriella gasped loudly, "Emergency." Nancy laughed immediately. "Oh Lord." Henry walked toward the fort with exaggerated seriousness. "What's happening in here?" Gabriella pointed proudly. "We need snacks." Henry nodded thoughtfully. "This is severe." Nancy crossed her arms playfully. "Y'all just ate dinner." "But emergencies don't wait," Grayson explained confidently. Henry burst into laughter, and for one beautiful moment, Nancy simply stood there watching him, really watching him. Not the billionaire, not the public figure, the father, the man who once looked emotionally exhausted every time he entered the penthouse. Now his laughter filled the home naturally. The difference felt almost unbelievable sometimes. Later that night, after finally getting the twins asleep upstairs, Henry found Nancy standing alone near the windows overlooking Chicago. The skyline glowed beautifully beneath the dark sky, while soft jazz played quietly behind them. Henry walked beside her naturally. "What you thinking about?" Nancy smiled softly. "How different everything feels." Henry nodded slowly. "Yeah." For several seconds, they simply stood together quietly. Comfortable silence, the healthiest kind. Nancy eventually looked toward him. "You ever regret any of it?" Henry answered immediately. "Never." The certainty in his voice touched her deeply. Even after all the pain, Even after the emotional destruction, Henry still chose honesty over the comfortable lies they once lived inside. That mattered. Henry wrapped one arm gently around her waist. "You know what I finally understand now?" "What?" "My whole life I thought love was supposed to look impressive." Nancy listened quietly. The right couple photos, the right social image, the right appearance. He shook his head softly. "But real love looks nothing like performance." Nancy leaned lightly against him. "What does it look like then?" Henry smiled faintly. "Burnt pancakes at 2 in the morning." Nancy laughed immediately. "Please, let those pancakes go. Never." He kissed her forehead softly before continuing. "It looks like children laughing too loud during dinner." His voice softened warmly. "It looks like somebody staying during the hard parts instead of only enjoying the beautiful ones." Nancy's eyes watered slightly, because, after everything, they had both stayed, not because life became easy, because truth finally made real connection possible. Downstairs, the twins suddenly shouted loudly from upstairs instead of sleeping, "Nancy!" Henry laughed, instantly. "There goes bedtime." Nancy smiled. Every single night. But neither of them sounded frustrated, because the noise no longer felt stressful. It felt alive. Nancy started walking toward the staircase, before Henry gently caught her hand first. She turned back toward him softly, and once again, that same emotional peace settled between them naturally. Not fantasy, not perfection. Something stronger. Trust. Henry smiled quietly. "You know they're gonna keep us awake forever, right?" Nancy laughed. "Probably." He kissed her gently again, and for the first time in his entire life, Henry Monroe finally understood something more valuable than wealth itself. A peaceful home matters more than a perfect image. The world respected power, admired money, celebrated appearances, but none of those things healed loneliness. Only honesty could do that. Only love built through patience, sacrifice, and truth could survive life when everything else collapsed. Nancy taught him that. The twins taught him that. Even Melissa, through all the pain, taught him that fear eventually destroys anything built without honesty. Months earlier, the penthouse looked perfect, while everybody inside quietly suffered. Now the house looked messier, louder, more emotional, more human, and somehow far more beautiful, because the family standing inside it finally belonged to truth instead of appearances. The twins grew happier with every passing month. Henry became emotionally present in ways he never experienced before, and Nancy, the woman everybody once overlooked, became the emotional heart of the home she helped save. Sometimes life breaks apart not to destroy people, but to remove the lies preventing them from healing. Truth hurts, but truth also frees. Love requires honesty. Respect matters more than status. And peaceful homes will always matter more than perfect appearances, because sometimes the quietest people carry the strongest hearts, and sometimes the woman holding the babies during the chaos was the one protecting everybody all along. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and share this video with someone who still believes kindness has no value. Because sometimes the quietest people protect us the most.